We are at 9 o'clock according to my time. Ariel, if we can put up the slides, recording in progress. Welcome. We're going to give folks a minute or so to hit critical mass, but just want to welcome everybody to the first meeting of this Rulemaking Advisory Committee. For RAC members, if you could please rename yourself with name and affiliation, pronouns if you choose. That'll be really helpful. If you haven't done that before, you can go on the ellipses, click on the three dots, and click rename. And we'll give it another minute or so, and we'll jump right in. So good to see folks. Thanks for those who are already modeling an ask that I'll make later, which is to have your screens on as much as possible, particularly for our RAC members. At least get the feeling of being in the room together as we kick off this process. Okay. I'm seeing a number of folks, so I'm gonna kick us off. So I want to welcome everyone to the Middle Housing Oregon Homes Rulemaking Advisory Committee. This is our first meeting. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new faces. Really excited to go through this process together. As a matter of introduction, my name is Ben Duncan. I'm a vice president with Currents and West. I'll be your facilitator on this journey that we'll be on. I'm joined by my colleague, Ariella Dallin, somewhere out there. Give a wave, Ariella. She'll be supporting this process, making sure that our meeting summaries are accurate, really be able to capture the wisdom and expertise in this space. So before I keep going, I wanted to welcome Vice Chair Lazo. Welcome. I see you as a wonderful guest today. I did unprompted want to just offer you any space if you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself to the group.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Lazo. I'm the current vice chair of the Land Conservation Development Commission. I'm getting some kind of feedback.
It's not feeding back to us, though, Vice Chair.
Thanks. And I just wanted to say I'm happy to be here and happy that we're continuing to move forward as a state and an agency in our commitment to increase housing production and also to go back and revisit areas where we can always improve on things like middle housing and the development of different housing types. So happy to be here and happy to see the folks that are here to help us move that forward. So thanks a lot, Ben.
Yeah.
Good morning to y'all.
Yeah, appreciate you joining, Vice Chair. So before we kind of move into some of the logistics and really dive into our agenda today, I'd love to introduce Ethan Stuckmeyer with the LCD to provide some opening and welcoming remarks.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Ben. Like Ben mentioned, my name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I manage the housing division at the Department of Land Conservation Development, and excited to welcome you to the first More Homes Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. This rulemaking is comprised, as the name implies, of a couple things, a couple tasks for this advisory committee. It is, yes, related to Oregon Homes, but it is also going to service the space for the department's work with you all related to another bill, 2138, related to middle housing and some other housing types. Try to find a fun, acronym. That's tough. So middle housing doesn't necessarily encapsulate all of the kind of phase 2 work, but it works really well for a good acronym, more homes. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation today. I'll introduce some other folks from DLCD that you'll see quite often in this setting. But before I do that, I want to mention that there's one person who's not here, which is Becky Coutinho, who is currently on parental leave, who's the person who is really going to be, your primary point of contact when it comes to Oregon Homes once she returns in mid-March. So they have to deal with me for the time being as your shepherd through Oregon Homes. But just know that Becky is going to be kind of your point of contact for this phase 1 work coming soon. Also with me today from DLCD side is Maddie Phillips. Maddie, if you come on and say hi.
Good morning, everyone. Madeline Phillips, friends and colleagues call me Maddie, but I'm here as support to Ethan for at least this first segment of our rulemaking work. And then we'll get into some work later in the long program down the road this year with public facilities related work around system development charges. So I'm your public facilities contact. I also come from local government, so I'll be offering some background there where there's opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. Thanks, and very nice to meet you all.
All right, and then two other folks who you'll see quite a bit in this process, Casaria Taylor.
Morning, everyone. Casaria Taylor. I am the Senior Rules Coordinator for DLCD.
And then Angela Williamson.
Good morning, everyone. Housing Division Coordinator, just here to help staff this.
All right, I know everybody in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee will have a chance to introduce themselves through the next couple moments here, but I just wanted to, say again, thank you for your time that you've already committed to this project, but are likely to commit in the future. I know that these Rulemaking Advisory Committee settings are sometimes difficult to navigate and they take up a bunch of time. So I appreciate in advance your enthusiasm, participation, excitement, comments, feedback, concerns, all of those things that you're likely to provide throughout this process. So just a preemptive thank you and appreciation.
And hey, Ethan, I just wanted to interrupt real quick and just mention that I'm Alexis Hammer. I'm the Legislative and Policy Manager at DLCD. I was involved in some of the legislative conversations that brought this bill forward. So I'll be here mostly in the background, but can provide context if needed from the legislative discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexis. Didn't see you in there.
All good. Thanks.
All right, Ben.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to move us through some kind of process onboarding, starting with the platform itself. So this is a Zoom meeting. It's being recorded, so you all are in a meeting. It's also live streamed. We do have a couple things that can help you contribute and participate. So one, closed captioning, if it's helpful for your participation. If you click on generally speaking, on the More button down at the bottom of your screen and click Show Captions, that will enable that function. We also have the Raise Hand button. So as we go through this process with discussion, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of managing our kind of process agreements, but using the Raise Hand button will get you into queue. I will also pay attention and respond to real human hands, but just from a Zoom functionality perspective, that's helpful. I'm going to ask, as much as possible, and I understand bandwidth and other issues that can prevent being on camera, but to the extent that folks can be on camera as much as possible, both as we all get to know each other, as the public is observing the process, and just to kind of recreate or try to mimic the feeling of being in community together. That'll be really helpful. I'm going to ask, and some folks have already done this, to rename yourself. If you could at least include your name and affiliation, that would be really helpful. If you choose to share pronouns, that's also helpful, certainly for me and your colleagues as we're engaging with each other. And then finally, because this is live streamed, the chat is not visible to the public. So we ask that you'll use chat function only for technical issues. And we have Angela, others on the DLCD and our team, but Angela in particular, will manage that chat to make sure that if there's any technical challenges you're having, that those are resolved. Anything that you do put in the chat, whether it's a question or a comment, I'll just lift up into the room or ask you to speak to it. So again, just asking you not to use chat for substantive contributions as we go through the process. But hopefully Zoom is not a new platform for you, but certainly reach out if you have any questions. If we go to next slide, I guess we've done some of this. Let's just go to the next slide. So our hopes for today, and I'll talk about how we'll use the agenda to move through these, is really to make sure that we're doing some onboarding and grounding to the process itself. So understanding the scope and the process that we're going to be using as we go through this phase one of the rulemaking, two-part rulemaking that Ethan's described, to ground us in an understanding of the program itself, the Oregon Homes program. And finally, really on meeting one, really to start diving into structure approach and pathways to align with legislative intent. So today will be both a grounding conversation, setting some context, but actually starting to get into some real discussion as a rulemaking body around how we're going to kind of approach this work moving forward. Next slide. In support of that, those outcomes, we'll move through an agenda. We'll do introductions with each other shortly. We'll spend a little bit of time again in a process onboarding. Much of that will be a repeat. Hopefully folks had the chance to read the packet and watch the pre-meeting videos. We'll have some Q&A on those, and this will be part of our process going forward. And hopefully this is working for folks. It's really intentional to put out information ahead of time rather than presenting and using a lot of this space for talking at you. So it really will be important. We'll continue to emphasize it. We'll assess how it's working for folks, but this is kind of how we're hoping to structure a lot of our agendas, right? Is to, instead of having a presentation with Q&A, to do that outside of the meeting, open it up for questions and clarity, and then be able to move into substantive conversations where we have ample time to discuss, to debate, to dialogue, right, to bring your expertise and wisdom into the room and guidance and advisory for DLCD. And then we'll get you out of here by noon, talking about some of the closing and next steps. So with that, any questions just around how we're going to spend our day today? Okay, that was your first chance to practice raising your hand with the raise hand button if you needed to. Let's do some introductions. This will be in alphabetical order. Just name, affiliation would be wonderful. We got a number of folks here, and we'll get to know each other in our discussions. And people will learn about your interest perspectives. So just go in alphabetical order by first name for today, and name and affiliation, whether that's organizational or community. Alexandra, you're first on the list.
I frequently am. Hi, folks. I'm Alexandra Ring. I'm the Housing and Land Use Lobbyist for League of Oregon Cities. We represent all 241 cities in the great state of Oregon. We are the doers and the implementers of this work.
Right, thanks, Alexandra. There's several folks that are what we describe as ex officio members. The first one, Andy Bolton. You hear Andy?
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Bolton. I'm the Acting Policy and Technical Services Manager at the Building Codes Division.
Thank you. Then Annika, how do you say it? Annika here. So I'm orienting to my screen. Okay, we'll come back to Annika. Brandon Persinger. Okay, let me try to pull up the participant list so I don't have to wait for folks. Brock, I saw Brock.
Yep. Hey, everybody. Brock Nation, Policy Director at Oregon Realtors.
Thank you. Catherine Rigby. Cheryl Bell. Destin Ferdin.
Hello, I'm Jessica Verdun. I am Director of Affordable Housing at Polish Commercial. We're a vertically integrated developer contractor.
All right, thank you. I'll get that right next time. So please excuse me if I butcher your name. Diego Diaz.
Hello, Diego Diaz, fellow at Housing Oregon and chapter lead at Salem, Yes in My Backyard.
Thank you, Diego. Elsa Natal. Eric Rutledge.
Good morning, Eric Rutledge, Community Development Director at the City of Sherwood, representing local government implementers. Thanks.
Fred Evander.
Hi there, Fred Evander, City of Independence, also local government.
Thank you. Jerica Ferguson.
Hi, my name is Jerica Ferguson. I am here in just a self-capacity.
Thank you. Jerry Lids. Jerry, I see you out there somewhere.
There we are. Took me a while to find the unmute button. I'm Jerry Lids. I'm here in my individual capacity. I also am a former LCDC commissioner and served on the older RAC meeting in 2019, 2020.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Jill Crop?
Hi, my name is Jill Kropp. I'm a sole practitioner architect with my company, Studio Crop Architecture. I'm also on the Development Review Advisory Committee for the City of Portland. I do mostly middle housing, primarily in the City of Portland, but also with a limited capacity in some of the neighboring metro areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Jim Taylor, ex officio of OHCS. Don't think I see Jim's name on there. John Rodriguez.
Yes, I'm John Rodriguez. I'm with the local governments also.
Thank you. Jonathan Balkema.
I'm Jonathan Balkema. I'm the building official for the city of Albany.
Okay, thank you. Karen Sachs.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Sachs with Dev Northwest. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy. Dev Northwest is an affordable housing developer and asset building organization serving 6.5 counties in Oregon, primarily doing community land trust homes, and we are active in the passage of the bill.
Thanks, Karen. Lee Armstrong.
That's better. Lee Armstrong, Habitat for Humanity, affordable home ownership developer.
Thank you. Mark Taylor. I saw Mark. Mary Kyle McCurdy.
Mary Kyle McCurdy, I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Associate Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Thank you. Morgan Tracy.
Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here. I've got a full cup of coffee for our 3-hour meeting, so I'm very excited. I'm a senior planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability with the City of Portland.
Thank you. Samantha Bear. Samantha. Shane Kwiatkowski.
Good morning, President. My name is Shane Kwiatkowski, she, her, they pronouns. I'm an individual and community advocate.
Thanks, Shane. Looks like, did I miss anybody or did somebody join after the alphabetical order? RAC members? Sarah.
Hi, good morning. My name is Sarah Absher. I'm the Director of Community Development for Tillamook County.
Great, thank you. Any other RAC members or folks that joined? Okay, not seeing any. So let's bring back up the slides and we'll keep moving through kind of an onboarding process and grounding. So if you go to the charter and operating principles slide, I'm going to be really brief. This is very high level. This was just a reflection of what was in your packet, but just wanted to provide a little bit of reflection on kind of the operating principles and the charter that was shared that describes kind of your purpose, the charge of the group, some of the guiding principles that we're really hoping and expecting you all to align with as we go through this process. And then some of the language around your responsibility as members, particularly operating in good faith. I'm going to talk about group agreements here in a second and to participate fully. And maybe before I move into meeting, well, actually, no, I'll come back to Q&A. So if you had questions around the charter or any of the process agreements that were shared, we'll do that here in a second. If you go to the next slide, I did want to just emphasize a few guidelines. So part of my role as a facilitator, right, you have kind of the roles and responsibilities that you all carry as members in terms of showing up in good faith and contributing your expertise in really important moments throughout this process. We also ask you to create a place where we can have constructive, productive conversation. And in order to support that, we ask, and part of my job is to hold us to these agreements, that we will be really intentional about the agenda and the questions that we're bringing forward. And to the extent that we can, we'll put those out in advance so you have time to really consider and think about the issues that we'll be bringing in. But we ask that you honor that, right? Honor the focus and topics that we're bringing forward, that you do your work for the pre-meeting. Like this structure only really works if you all have come in with spending the time in the pre-meeting materials and understanding the conversation that we're hoping to have. Generally in a virtual environment, speaking one at a time is not necessarily a challenge. We have the power of the mute button, but I will just say, part of our obligation is to make sure we're hearing from everyone. And that also means that if folks are kind of the first one to raise their hand every single time, I might ask you to step back a little bit. If I haven't heard from you, I might try to invite you in. So I'll just ask that folks, not just be mindful and conscientious of the time that you're taking up as an individual, but really paying attention to who we're hearing from, who are we not, and really, creating space for each other. To be curious, right? We have a lot of different interests and perspectives in this room. And your ability to really listen, to understand, not just to respond, but to listen, to understand, to learn from each other, and doing so, being respectful and candid, and doing so in the purpose of constructive and productive conversations. We do not have to, reach consensus as an advisory body, but to the extent that we are finding and seeking common ground, that we're aligning around things that will work across the state for the multiple interests in this room. All of that is a gift to DLCD as they work to kind of translate our conversations and your feedback into ultimately what we adopted in rules. One of my colleagues often says, be soft on people, hard on issues. So what we want you to do is to address issues, to ask questions, but not to direct your comments to people or organizations. So we'll just ask that you hold that balance, right? To really focus on the issues, on the tension points, on the conflict, but not to make it personal. Like I said, trying to find common ground is a gift to the agency, and to the extent that our discussions lead us to those places, that will be wonderful. And then finally, just naming stuff early, and we're going to do our best to ask the type of questions that allow you to bring your interests into the space for us to kind of sit with some of the difficult tension, sticking points, whatever the words are, as early as possible, right? This is a pretty fast process, but we want to move through it and have you hear from you as early as possible in doing so. If you go to the next slide, Ethan mentioned this, and it was introduced as part of the pre-work going into this meeting, but we are going to also do our best to continually ground ourselves in the racial equity framework. And this is a directive from the Land Conservation Development Commission to the department, right, to embed kind of equity considerations in rulemaking processes. And, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what we're going to ask you to do as we go through this process is to look at kind of the history and the past in order to inform the future, right? What we might call unintended consequences. What's the context that we're operating in? What are we trying to solve for? What are some of the ways that previous practice and policy has contributed to inequitable access to housing, for example? Understanding the impacts by examining benefits and burdens, who benefits, who might be burdened by an issue, how do we mitigate the negative impacts, and how do we lift up the things that work? What's the type of data, and that's both quantitative or qualitative, that can guide our analysis? I'm not asking you all to be data experts, but there'll be a lot of data through storytelling, through lived and professional experience that shows up in this space. How do we hold that as we have this conversation and really center ourselves on those who have been most excluded from the benefits of building and having enough housing for our state? And then to the extent that both, for the agency, for previous efforts, for those of you who represent community or our membership organizations, et cetera, like what does community engagement look like? How have we empowered community voice to inform our conversations, that meaningful involvement of people that will be impacted by the work that this advisory body does? And finally, all of that trying to contribute to decision-making that ultimately results in restorative justice, right? How are we reconciling and repairing the challenges of the past for a brighter, more productive future? How are we holding accountability to outcomes? How are we measuring and doing continuous improvement, which is, somewhat a metaphor or an analogy to this work itself, right? Continuing to kind of explore, how do we get better? How do we address the challenges? So we'll be asking you to hold that as we go through this process. If you go to the next slide. And then I'll just at a very high level, and Ethan, you can fill in all the blanks for me. So, this is structured as phase 1 and phase 2. And hopefully folks are really understanding, right? Phase 1 around Oregon homes. This is kind of a fast track sprint to August of 2026 to look at the Oregon Homes program, and ultimately to be able to make the process faster and more predictable. With permit-ready building plans and eligible sites, and we can answer any questions that folks have around those relationships and distinctions, and recognizing that part of the scope challenge that we'll have is that there's 2 parallel processes with Building Codes Division and DLCD and Department of Consumer and Business Services to coordinate, right? Even though there's kind of 2 scopes and parallel processes moving. And then we'll move into phase 2, which will kick off late this fall in September 2026 to really look at HB 2138. And as Maddie predicted, to look at some of the some of the other issues that will arise and think about equitable housing outcomes and home ownership opportunities. What did I say, Ethan?
The slide mentioned September 26th, but I do want to just call out that those there won't be time there won't be a space of time between phase 1 and phase 2. I just want to mention that we'll shift like immediately into phase 2. So kicking off in August of 2026.
Perfect. Seamless. It'll be seamless. I guess we'll promise that. Okay, so why don't I pause there and just ask if there's any clarifying questions really around your role, responsibility, the charter, guiding principles, any other group agreements that would help you fully participate, scope, etc. Jill, jump in, please.
Hi, I have a question about for ground rules. The presentation talked about consistent views and feedback in RAC and other venues. I wasn't exactly sure what you meant by that, or maybe if you could provide an example.
Ethan, do you want to
Thanks.
speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Good question, Jill. I think what is articulated there is a sense of bringing those viewpoints, those concerns into this rulemaking advisory committee space is really the primary means of engagement that DLCD will have with rulemaking advisory committee members, and which is kind of the basis upon which the department will be drafting recommended rules for consideration by the Land Conservation Development Commission. And the ask there is that those concerns be consistent both in the rulemaking advisory committee, and then should somebody in the rulemaking advisory committee say provide public comment or public testimony at the LCDC public hearing, then we're not kind of hearing or hopefully we're not hearing those concerns for the first time, or it's a different concern at the LCDC meeting or in a different venue where we might be talking about this rulemaking, and just a request that those views or those concerns be consistent both in these rulemaking advisory committee spaces, but also where we might also engage with you outside of just these meetings, this meeting series. Did that help answer the question?
Thanks, Ethan. Morgan?
Just a couple questions on clarification about the phasing schedule. Are we anticipating, and I don't expect this, but hopeful, are we anticipating some interim recommendations coming out of the committee in those phases that might be earlier, that might move to the LCDC for earlier adoption? That's for first question. Second question is, have we accounted for, does this account for the LCDC decision-making timeframe? So post-September, does it go into beyond that? Thanks.
Very good questions. Yeah, and worth taking a moment here to pause on. So in the whole scope of this rulemaking, middle housing, Oregon Homes is both bills, HB 2258, which is the Oregon Homes bill, and HB 2138, which is the middle housing and other housing types bills, including SDC, system development charges. The timeline to adopt the Oregon Homes portion, that program, is targeted for an adoption at the Land Conservation Development Commission at their meeting in August of 2026. So it is full steam ahead, all focus on Oregon Homes to meet that timeframe. And that timeframe does include the public hearing and adoption time at LCDC. So this group will meet for the last time discussing Oregon homes at the end of July. And then commission will meet to hold a public hearing kind of around a similar timeframe. I think that meeting is the 29th of July is the public hearing for these rules. And then the cadence at LCDC is one meeting is a public hearing. We do some work to update the rules based on what we heard from both public and the commission at those meetings. And we come back with a final set of recommended rules for commission adoption in August. So even though that time frame is between today and late August for full adoption, this committee's work will kind of, for all intents and purposes, conclude by July of 2026. So we want to include that LCDC adoption timeframe in there.
Oh, sorry, Ethan.
And then, yeah, to talk through a little bit about on your first question about kind of phasing and recommendations. So in the context of this rulemaking advisory committee, what the purpose of these meetings are is to kind of toss around ideas, concepts, policy drafts of rules for your feedback and discussion, for prompting concerns you have, questions you need answers, things about like, oh, I didn't think this was going to go this way. Can we talk about this a little bit more? So to kind of meet that, these meetings will kind of serve as opportunities to see how those rules are shaping up towards those proposed set of rules that'll go in front of commission in both July and August of 2026. So for Oregon homes, the timeframe is short enough where we probably won't have like a full set of draft rules for your consideration in total until we get into the summer months, May and June or so. But the purpose of these meetings to hold them between now and that time is to have chunks of drafts for your consideration. So that first discussion will take place today in the latter half of our meeting. And then our next meeting, when we reconvene in March, you'll see, how we've iterated based on the conversation that we have today. We'll have a further detailed set of either recommendations or policy questions for your digestion and conversation. It'll kind of all lead into this full set of drafts in May, June, July, and August. You'll see several series of drafts throughout the process.
Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, thank you.
And then I guess just to fully be complete on that, phase 2 is a much longer time. So I would say you could probably be anticipating a even more kind of sets of drafts, iterations on the other parts of rules on the 2138 version of those rules or portion of this rulemaking. So we've got the luxury of more space and spaced out meetings to actually hear what you all are saying, work internally to get some drafts moving, and then have something for you to really chew on, digest, and like dig into in phase 2. So you might see it just a slight pivot in approach between phase 1 and phase 2.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. Any other questions around kind of the process side of things? Charter, scope, group agreements, guiding principles?
And while that question marinates, I just want to highlight that you'll see in that charter document a big draft watermark on it. And that's intentional for folks to, sit with it, digest it a little bit, ask questions, poke, prod, adjust, all that kind of stuff. Those are, our collective agreements and not forecast upon you. So.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Ethan. So hopefully that may prompt some additional either questions or comments. It really is meant to not just provide some clarity, but to make sure that we have shared expectations. Jerica, jump in. You're on mute, Jerica.
Quick question. I'm just taking an assumption. I am forgetting off the top of my head the timeline in both bills, but my assumption is that the bills are determining the decision around this timeline. Just thinking out loud of, it sounds like the middle housing 2138 is much more focused in equitable outcomes, where 2258 is around permitting and fasting, like creating a faster and more predictable or permit ready. I just want to note, just for myself, it's fascinating to hear that we want to get permits out before talking about equity. And so I just would like to make that as a note for, future discussion. It seems to me that it would be smart to have actually flipped these to start that, but obviously bills are bills, but just making that as a note.
Yeah, fair point. Appreciate it. The statutory deadlines included in both bills are different. And the statutory deadline for HB 2258, the Oregon Homes portion, is January. Those rules need to be adopted in place effective by January 1st, 2027. So we have the year of 2026 to get those completed. And getting the August puts us ahead of schedule there. And then because those conversations on 2138 are, you dive deeper into those, they do have those implications, as you suggest. They are focused on, those reasonable siting and design standards and how, we're threading in those conversations. The deadline for adoption of those rules and implementation under 2138 is January 1st of 2028. So the timelines afforded in those bills from a statutory perspective allow kind of that phasing, diving deeper into each of those individual pieces.
Yeah, Jarek, I appreciate you naming that observation in terms of the timeline and sequencing. And I'll also offer that I think while it's explicitly stated, for example, in the slides and kind of legislative direction, but I think the challenge for this group is to hold and think about and consider equitable outcomes across both phases of this rulemaking. So again, we're going to try, as we go into some of this next parts of our conversation, to really tee that up structurally, and through kind of consideration of the type of questions that we're asking, so we don't lose that, even if it's not kind of explicitly part of the legislative intent of 2258. Thank you for naming it.
Yeah, and just to kind of dive into that a little bit more, I mean, the conversation or the way that these rulemaking advisory committee meetings are likely to be structured is around that racial equity framework for decision making. Like that'll show up in every single one of these meetings, whether it's the Oregon Homes phase or the next phase. So those considerations are top of mind, both for DLC staff, but I know I don't want to speak for Vice Chair, but I also know for the commission as well.
I saw a little heart coming from Alan, Vice Chair Lazo. So we'll take that as an endorsement of holding that framework through the process. But anything to add, Vice Chair?
No, I think you said it beautifully, Ben. The way the process is designed comes to us from the legislature, from the governor's office about priorities, but it doesn't preclude us from considering the context for which the housing crisis and the affordability crisis is developed in this state and across the country, frankly.
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, that's just space. Any questions, other questions around charter process, scope, timelines? If there's anything else folks need from a group agreement standpoint to feel like you can fully contribute? Yeah, Vice Chair.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm curious, Ethan, you mentioned the charter as a draft. I'm just curious, is the whole document is what you consider the charter? Because nothing there is really named the charter. So is it from the charge to the guidelines and all of that? So, and are you looking for feedback on that document?
Yeah, probably just an issue of me using the wrong terminology, but I would call that document, the guiding principles document, as something that is, an expression of those expectations of DLCD and RAC involvement and participation and collaboration in these meetings. But I know that one of the things within is the rulemaking charge that the Land Conservation Development Commission adopted in their initiation of this rulemaking. I would say of the things in that guiding principles document, that's the most rigid because commission that is a directive of the commission. But other things, I mean, happy to provide clarifications where people feel like it's not clear or add things. We probably we won't necessarily be taking a vote or formalizing that in any means throughout this process, but you know, that is the document that we will refer to over the when it's appropriate throughout this rulemaking process, just in terms of what those expectations are and should there be, I don't know, some sort of issue in the process. That's kind of where we go back to say, hey, this is what we kind of all agreed to, or you know, we set forth in the beginning of this process. So
Yeah, that's a helpful clarification. Charge and purpose is not really flexible, but the kind of how we do our work and move through this process together. Again, it needs to reflect what's going to best work for you all along the timelines and needs for the agency to be able to elicit the type of information that's going to inform ultimately the draft and future adopted rules. So. Say you're supposed to wait 8 seconds after you've asked a question, which always feels like a lot when you're like staring at a bunch of faces and boxes. This will, at any point, I'll encourage you. I know we've talked to some of you and worked with some of you before. At any point in time, feel free to reach out to myself or Ariella, to Ethan and the team at DLCD if there's process improvements that you can make. And we'll be doing some touch points as we go through this. So just, you know, this is not your last chance to kind of contribute to how we do our work together. But let's keep us moving, because this will be now, we're going to move into kind of the first attempt to kind of try out, if you will, this new structure of process. And so at every one of our meetings, as I said earlier, we're going to put out information ahead of time. For those of you, right, that do it on your own time, there'll always be space to watch the pre-meeting videos, presentations right before this meeting. So if you block out that time, you'll be able to have it, but it also gives you some flexibility to do it, you know, on your own time that works for you. What we will not do is kind of re-present to you. And that's kind of our first commitment at this point, is not represent what we already put out there. So that just should be your kind of first reminder, warning, expectation, whatever the words are, that the pre-work is important, and that's going to set you up for success. What we will do, as we will today, is open up some space for clarifying questions. So there's a couple things that hopefully you noticed in the pre-materials. One, there'll be kind of an overarching memo. DLCD will consistently, I imagine this has been your practice, kind of asterisks or star the things that if you don't have a lot of time, start there. Those are going to be the most consequential things to examine and familiarize yourself with before coming into the space. So hopefully folks kind of, you know, were able to navigate that. All right, so I do want to open it up then for clarifying questions. So from the materials you developed, from not the process materials, but from the substantive kind of content-based presentations, just want to create some space for clarifying questions. And this really is a space to help you ask those questions, to ground each other and yourself before we move into a more substantive discussion. So please don't be shy. We're all coming into this work at different levels. Some of you live and breathe this every single hour of every single day. Others do not. So just really want to invite folks in, be courageous with your question, or you know, don't feel like there's any question that's that shouldn't be asked. Yeah, Jill.
Hi, I have kind of a big picture question. So I watched the presentation, and then I read through the House bill for the Oregon homes. And I guess it's not clear to me, are we, I wrote a question here. So So are we proposing a process for jurisdictions to review, like to be able to quickly approve these pre-done plans, or are we, I guess I'm not exactly sure, like exactly
Yeah.
what we're proposing, what we're working on trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's a good place to start in the first meeting. So let's talk a little bit about DLCD's role, right? DLCD is the agency that I guess shepherds, stewards the land use planning program in the state. Local governments, cities, counties, are the implementers. Those are the folks who are, you know, like Alexandra mentioned in the beginning, those are the doers of this work. And so when it comes to the Oregon Homes program, DLCD in its rulemaking capacity would establish what's articulated in the bill, which is a series of rules and procedures and frameworks that local governments would use to approve, review, and shepherd the development of Oregon homes within their community. So that could, in terms of DLCD's rulemaking scope here, we're talking about approval processes. Like what approval processes could a local government apply to the review of an Oregon home development proposal? It also includes some land use standards, siting and design standards, whether that's some of the things related to the shape, format, bulk, scale of those Oregon homes. Things like what's a minimum and maximum setback, like what are the floors and ceilings that a local government could apply to those particular Oregon home developments. And then also related to, specifically called out in HB 2258, related to tree removal. So there are standards that, or rules that DLCD would write that would say, here are the kind of tree removal procedures, processes, criteria that a local government could or should or must use in the review and approval of an Oregon home application. So we're, as the state agency, setting the framework by which local governments would engage and implement the Oregon Homes program when it comes to somebody at the reviewing an application for an Oregon home, on any given lot within their jurisdiction. Does that help?
So just so I'm clear, so the idea is that all the jurisdictions throughout Oregon would evaluate these specific Oregon home projects the same in terms of zoning requirements.
Same is I think the department through this rulemaking process would establish like what are the acceptable processes that a city might apply. One of the potential outcomes of this rulemaking process is that every single one of those standards is exactly the same across the state. That's one outcome. Another outcome is that there's a range of acceptable standards that we might consider. And then a city can kind of pick and choose which standards they might apply through that process. And so that's with the help of you all in this rulemaking process. Kind of how we land on some of those questions is really informed by the experts in this room.
Yeah, and Joe, those questions, I mean, this will be potentially an ongoing set of questions around kind of where these conversations are going, and hopefully coming out of today, you'll get a flavor of kind of how we might approach that, and just paying attention to folks kind of seeing the faces move, right? I think landing on predictable in terms of legislative intent is probably a fair way to say it, but hopefully that's helpful. Thank you, Ethan. And some of this is the last comment you made is really important, right? So some of those direction is really the purpose of this group's conversation, helping to kind of chart that path, what's going to work at the local level while creating predictability across the state. How is it going to speed up permitting processes with clarity, while also just finding the right balance so it will work in all these unique places and jurisdiction around the state.
Right, and that is like the pure nugget of this rulemaking process. Like, how do you hold all of those things, predictability, you know, and production and time and cost and all of those things in establishing the framework by which then local governments would implement this program. So that comes from everybody in this room's expertise, their experiences. That comes from, you know, the legislative direction and intent. That comes from you know, how cities operate their land use development codes and approval processes. We have to hold all of those things as we're navigating where we land on each of these big discussion and decision points.
Yep, that's helpful. And to your point, Ethan, I mean, I think this makeup of this RAC has been intentionally reflective of kind of the implementers, the developers, the builders, right? The folks that would access the housing and benefit from the housing, right? So hopefully all those perspectives, you know, help advise and chart a path forward that really can work and reach the kind of ultimate goals of building more middle housing across the state. Thank you Jill for leading off the questions. Any other questions for clarity around the presentation? Yeah, Morgan?
I'm sorry, it's not really a clarity question. I just wanted to add another perspective to the range of housing that we're trying to produce. It's not just numbers, it's a range of different types and needs. So we all of our cities have different housing needs. We've done housing needs analysis for that. So that's yet another thing to layer into our decision-making process or recommendation process.
Yeah, thanks for naming that. We'll maybe get into a little bit of that today. Shane, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that, just piggybacking on that perspective, when I had a meeting with Ethan, the Bermuda Triangle that I want to get lost in is cost, efficiency, dignity, and beauty, right? Because for me, that is what I grew up in the Northwest, that regardless of where you started on the point, you always find yourself in the middle. Well, amending injustice and systemic inequality, right? But that's the aim I have, is can we produce things at cost for the world we're in a way that we'll be proud with for the future, and we're not putting people in sardine boxes. That's my perspective.
Yeah, love that, Shane. We'll be coming as we get into some of the next conversation, that real contextualization of kind of what has been kind of the historic and to some extent contemporaneous realities that are providing right cost, efficiency, and dignity. To your point, Eric, jump in.
Thank you. What is the date for implementation for local government? And it sounds like we're moving quick, would that be sped up if LCDC adopts by August?
Good question. So the part of the rulemaking or the rule adoption process is that the effective date of those rules is likely sometime shortly thereafter the rules are adopted. So it takes some time to do like the paperwork processing of adopted rules, but those Oregon Homes program would be live, kind of shortly thereafter the August adoption. I don't have an exact date. Usually we try to target the beginning of the following month, but that turnaround will be a little tight. So sometime mid-September-ish for kind of go live. Oregon Homes effective, those rules are in place. Local governments are and builders are able to utilize that program.
Oh, thank you, Ethan. I would just encourage, and I think DLCD does a great job with this, but if the date is likely to be before the statutory deadline of January 1st, just making sure you're getting that in front of the local jurisdictions so they're very aware. And really LCDC does a great job of that through virtual meetings and open houses and email blasts. And then a follow-up question, if I can, Ben and Ethan.
Yeah, please.
It gets to the presentation. I'm just thinking about, I understand there's a distinction between our role on this RAC and the actual development and approval of the actual homes from a building code standpoint. Can you just talk more about that? process? Is there a separate RAC? I'm just thinking about our building official here and trying to, allow him to stay in the loop. And then, I guess also from the local government's perspective, in implementation and also for the sake of the program, are we going to get out there and our building officials going to start failing, inspections in an inconsistent basis based on how that process went. So maybe you can just walk through that process, that'd be good. Thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the important things that we'll be needing to navigate in this rulemaking space is that I know that there's going to be an interest in talking about the actual structures themselves. However, that is not the scope of DLCD's rulemaking and this committee's conversation over the rulemaking process. However, the inner relationship between the siting and design standards and how DLCD is crafting those recommended rules for LCDC consideration needs to be informed by what those structures actually look like. And so there's work that DLCD and BCD will be doing to make sure that we're having the same kinds of conversation and informing each other on the process. But Andy, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I see you're here. If you want to speak to any of the BCD portions of this work, feel free. But
sure. Yeah, just briefly, we had a little bit of an advantage on DLCD in that we didn't actually get new authority when it comes to permit ready plans. In 2258, that was authority that had kind of already existed with the division, and the program had just kind of fallen out of use a little bit. They had previously been referred to as ready build plans. And to the extent that the program had been used in the past, it was mostly for things like outbuildings, pole barns. And so we sort of modernized it a little bit and created a process in rule. And that actually happened last fall when we had a RAC around that process. And we've since started putting out some new permit ready plans, again, for more outbuildings so far, but are looking to expand in the near future into ADUs and small homes. Sorry, not small homes, just like a normal 3-2, not an actual small home. And part of the process of approving those plans is a built-in review period where it goes out to local jurisdictions. And local jurisdictions, including local building officials, will have the opportunity to look at these plans and be able to get back to the division and say, this won't work in my jurisdiction, here's why. And so it won't necessarily be a complete just sort of plan is done and top down going out to local jurisdictions saying this plan is done, you have to approve it. There'll be an opportunity to review at the local level and make sure it actually works in that jurisdiction.
Right. And Eric, I don't know if that answers your question around failing inspections. That seemed very specific, but
Yeah, do you mind if I ask just one more thing? And I don't want to get too much into it. My last question on this topic. I just for example, I assume that the ready build homes and whatever's going to be under this program has safety nets, if you will, for if DLCD in this committee says, hey, you can do a 1.5 foot setback from a property line, well, then that changes the firewall requirements. And so, I would hope that we're not approving then or required to approve a building at a 1.5 foot setback with no firewall, for example, because the ready home, the Oregon home didn't require one. So that's kind of what I get to. And then the inspector goes out there and says, wait a minute, this is 2 feet from a property line. Where's your XYZ per the building code? So it really gets to safety for me. So thanks.
yeah, and I don't know, Andy or Ethan, if there's a comment on that. I think, Eric, that's part of the conversation that we'll be having as we go through this process is kind of where are those tension points with where we're trying to go and what could work from a kind of site perspective, and what are those, kind of potential conflicts, risks, tensions with existing requirements. Is that a fair, Ethan? Jump in.
Yeah, yes, I think that's fair. It's incumbent upon DLCD staff and BCD to work and consult and make sure that those kind of things are going to be, as seamless as they can across both of those. And one wrinkle that I wanted to kind of highlight, and I think can't remember if this is next meeting or the meeting following, but soon we will be talking about this additional wrinkle that's part of the 2258 process, which is that builders can apply for their own approval, pre-approval of those Oregon homes. And that is going to have an impact on the siting and design standard conversation that we are having as part of this rulemaking advisory committee. You know, how do we square those two? Is there a process where those pre-approved plans have, I don't know, criteria that they need to meet because they need to also meet the siting and design standard that we're talking about here? Or are the siting and design standards more dependent on the pre-approved Oregon home itself? And we'll get into some of that this morning in the next portion of the agenda to speak about, like, how are the rules structured to accommodate those things? But we'll have an intentional, specific conversation about that throughout this process.
Thank you. Shane?
Thank you. I just have two questions related to process. First, in previous iterations of rulemaking, I found it deeply helpful when there were pre-meetings, like say the Monday prior, they ended up having like an FAQ, session, right? When we come to individual meetings, will there be the same resource available if people want to have that?
We definitely can. Happy to hold those. And I'll just elaborate, if I could, Shane, on what that entails. So in rulemaking process that DLCD has recently concluded over the course of 2024 and 2025, the substance was very deep, very technical, very in the weeds, like big conversations. And so we held these spaces prior to the rulemaking advisory committee meetings themselves for folks to kind of ask these clarifying questions. It was a non-required, voluntary, kind of like open house kind of approach. And those kind of things are something we can definitely implement here as well.
Because just insertion, I really understand that in terms of like, if we're just not getting into as technical of a code and or just time or staff constraints, I really understand the world is getting more complicated by the day. So maybe it's just per people's request, or perhaps, if I have further questions or concerns, we can always reach out to a staff member to provide further technical assistance and technical understanding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I think we will strive to include those open houses in previous or prior to the future meetings, but that doesn't exempt or preempt any kind of rulemaking advisory committee member from reaching out to DLCD staff with questions. Hey, I really am struggling to understand this part. Can I sit down with you for some time and just talk it through? Like that kind of conversation is always welcomed, encouraged, and we always have time for those kind of conversations.
All right, great. And then my second question, I did not make that thumb up, so I don't know what ghost is in this meeting right now. I'm just saying. Anyways, so the second question in terms of process, I don't know if it's a question or a recommendation. Especially, I'm just trying to understand per meeting, is there a possibility for the documents prior to the meeting that we could just have a little like square where it's like, this is the scope in terms of this is the container we're establishing per meeting in terms of what do we analyze and what are we actually discussing to be on the same page. And then secondly, I would just like to know, explain it to me like I'm 5 years old and a simple 5-year-old, right? In terms of what is it in that meeting? What are the recommendations we can make? For example, in the meeting previous to this, I'm super passionate about urban forestry and incorporating urban canopy into missing middle housing and the urban framework. I understand this is not an urban canopy and urban forestry practice, but are there ways that we could recommend rule changes that could encourage that, for example, and what is that scope? Very hyper-specific example, but just for the sake of efficiency and also just not wasting anyone's time, I would hate to make recommendations that just out and out are just not appropriate for this meeting. And also, I'd love to know what the scope is, because then, hey, I can really try to put my creative brain to the test of how, from my perspective, could I try to synergize different kinds of needs as well as different barriers that people in the room may have.
Yeah, great points. I think one of the things that even since we published the packet with those pre-recorded materials and the just since last Wednesday when that was published, we've gotten comments and questions on how this is going to work, and have even learned some lessons in that short amount of time as well. And so we'll commit to continuing to iterate and try this new process out. So those kind of feedback and suggestions always welcome. We would also have already discussed the need for some pre-work on the discussion questions, or like framing up the discussion that you'll see in the next packet, that we've already identified that was kind of like, we left folks in a little bit of a lurch with those meetings and then those recorded materials and no connection to the discussion that we were likely to have.
And I don't know if this is an actual real suggestion, just throw it away if it's not useful. I find that when, especially like say developer's perspective, I've loved learning more about my developers over the last decade of my advocacy, and just being like, no, developers are great, right? But sometimes they just don't know the perspective or where the developer is coming from. So say, for example, we're having a meeting of like building envelope, right? Would it be possible to like maybe give an example question of say what would be important to a developer in the scope of that meeting versus like an advocate's question? Because for me, if I looked at that meeting, it's like my advocate side is how can we increase cost diversity? But then the question from the developer may be, that's all fine and good, but what can we actually accomplish with this set of barriers that actually meets as many goals as we have? I just find that if I think of a question from someone else's perspective previous to a meeting, it really helps my research and my building of empathic understanding for the perspectives of the other people. That I would love to be a developer. I ain't not that now. So I just want to understand more what developers need, for example.
Okay, good example. Yeah, we can think through ways to make that a reality.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, Shane, and to the extent that we can make that a reality prior to the meeting, I think one of the things we'll be trying here very shortly is actually starting and really asking folks to contextualize this conversation through the interests that are around this room. So we are starting to immediately hear, right, from the advocate side, from the developer side, from the local government side, right, fill in the blanks from the architect side, what is finance side, whatever the interest based is, kind of what's getting in the way, what has been the experience, what are we trying to solve for, what's the historical context, who's been impacted, right? So we're going to move in very shortly to that conversation in the meeting. And I just appreciate, like, we're on the same wavelength in terms of how do we ensure that before we get into substantive policy conversations, we've had a chance to hear those perspectives. So to Ethan's point, and to your ask, let's try to bring it in before the meeting, but certainly I think we're going to try to structure our meetings so we don't just leap into policy discussions before having some contextual kind of perspective conversations.
I love that. And I just want to say as well what I said to Ethan in a pre-meeting, I really appreciate having all the info and presentations prior, because as much as I am an extrovert, my little introvert research side is I need to be a little beaver and put the logs together. You know what I mean? Just so I know I'm having a good combo. So I really appreciate all of your efforts.
I always love your little beaver putting the logs together. Thank you for that gift. So we can start to move into the conversation, but I didn't want to move on before we've made sure folks feel grounded in any questions you had about the meeting materials. Okay. Jill?
I'm trying to wait to let other people raise their hand, but I do have a question.
That's all right. They've had ample time to raise their hand. Jump in.
Okay. In kind of technical, I have a couple scope questions. You said that the Oregon Homes does include multifamily housing between 6 and 12. So I'm just wondering, do stacked attached duplexes, are they involved in this scope?
Yes.
Okay, so then would that mean that you couldn't have a 4-unit stacked attached duplex be part of this?
Let me think about that.
Do you need clarity about what I'm asking for?
Maybe, yeah.
Jonathan,
maybe not everybody knows what a stacked attached duplex is because it's a relatively new
I saw
housing.
Jonathan's hand come up, maybe in some context.
Yeah, I can help with that one if you want. So earlier last year, BCD authorized what ends up looking like a duplex, but you can have attached duplex, a townhouse, but you can have attached duplexes. So those would be potentially allowed because those up to 4 is still just middle housing. So it would fall under the middle housing, and then you would branch into the 6 unit would be multifamily.
Okay.
With the big distinction is the 4 and under doesn't require any sprinkler system. The above needs a sprinkler system.
That
Great.
answer? Yeah, Bill, keep going.
Yeah, and then kind of related to that, I'm wondering as we're giving suggestions, with this program, are we trying to be consistent with some of the state rules that already exist? For example, like the cottage cluster model code. Is it important that we're not proposing something that contradicts what's already in place, or is that okay to do?
I think that's an ideal as something we should strive for, which is to not create these like conflicting or new or different sets of standards.
Yeah, I think to the extent that there's kind of universal understanding of where those conflicts are, that certainly is likely a barrier for some folks around the room. So I think that, we'll land a little bit on DLCD and for folks that kind of live and breathe this work to help identify where those conflicts might show up, right? Because I imagine there's some folks in the room that will have ideas that may be in conflict that just wouldn't know that.
Yeah, and I think just kind of elaborating on that, one of the things that DLCD commits to in these rulemaking situations is to provide options. So to provide more than one option for consideration in this setting and to kind of highlight have both either highlight the pros and cons of those various options as part of that kind of proposal that we're putting forward for y'all considerations, but also to hear from folks in this room about really don't like that one for this reason, or maybe a hybrid version of those proposals works better. And so that's a place where DLCD and providing those options and that commitment to providing options can highlight where there might be a departure from some of those existing standards or a rethink or a reimagination of how the pieces all fit together.
Okay. Other comments, thoughts? Okay. Well, I'm going to have us take a break in a minute, but maybe before we do that, Ariel, if you could pull up the background and context. I just want to introduce some questions for you all to take on your break, because we're going to get into kind of a 2-part conversation. One that's going to be more big picture, that's contextual, kind of the conversation we've been teeing up around kind of what are we trying to solve for, what are the existing kind of barriers and realities, and really invite folks from their different perspectives. So if we can put up the background and context slide, I'm going to introduce that. We'll take a break. We'll have that conversation, and then Ethan's going to kind of present on our first kind of application and discussion that's really related to kind of forward thinking. So as promised and introduced, as a racial equity framework, what we're trying to attempt, and this gets to some of the comments we've heard earlier, Jericho, your comments in particular around how we're embedding equity into this part of the process as well as kind of phase 2. So with the legislative direction, right, just really understanding like we're trying to get to build more middle housing, permitting faster with predictability, right, at a very high level. As you all think about how we're going to ground ourselves in the legislative direction and the need for what we're trying to accomplish here as a state, thinking about how do we understand with the intention to avoid disproportionate impact into really replicating harm, or replicating the barriers, or replicating kind of what hasn't worked. And so I'm going to ask folks to think about this. And what I'll say is, I really am going to want to invite, it doesn't mean I have to hear from every single individual, but I'd really like to hear from all the different types of interests in this room, right? To Shane's kind of ask and curiosity from before, right? Really wanting to hear, like, how does this land from an advocate experience or a lived experience? How is this working at or not working at a local city implementer planning and permitting level? How is this, working on the development business, building side? How is this working, whether it's finance or architecture, et cetera, right? So not knowing all the necessarily interests in the room explicitly, really wanting to hear from folks thinking about these questions. When we think about kind of broadly citing and design standards, how have they impacted communities positively or negatively? And while we are centered on a racial equity framework, we want to also think about for low-income populations, for communities of color, for people with disabilities, et cetera, right? Kind of really thinking about what's the landscape that we're operating in and that we're trying to improve upon. What barriers have existed preventing housing from being built? Right, for those of you that are developers trying to navigate, right, to build middle housing, what's prevented that from happening, particularly as it relates to the scope of this conversation. Where's power been held? Right? What communities have held power and influence over siting design, and that might be at the government level, might be at the advocate level, might be at the the community level. What communities have not? Right? Really, again, grounding ourselves in some of these racial equity framework questions. And finally, is there data, and that's qualitative and quantitative, that helps us understand previous or future consequences? That might be the cost, efficiencies, timelines, right? It might be pain points, housing outcomes, et cetera. Right. So I'm going to ask us to take a 10-minute break. And this will be kind of our first opportunity to really come in through your lens. And I want you to somewhat be selfish in this conversation. What does this look like to you? And listen and learn from each other. And then we're going to hold that as we go into our next conversation to actually talk about policy pathways so we don't ever lose kind of the grounding on the impact and what we're trying to solve for as we kind of get into the more technical and policy-based approaches. Okay, so let's take it's 10:16 on my clock. If we can take 10 minutes, we'll come back at 10:26. We'll open with this conversation. We'll have a short presentation by Ethan teeing up the next discussion, and we'll go from there. Now it's 10:17, 10:27. All right, see you in 10. Welcome folks back. If you see enough faces or thumbs ups or something, we'll consider folks back. Okay. Appreciate folks honoring the 10 minutes. I know it goes by fast when you're multitasking and trying to balance your whole life in a short period of time. If we can pull up the slide again, I'll just kind of reopen the conversation. And again, I'll just reiterate, there's my hope that this is our kind of first opportunity to kind of set a precedent for the way that we engage in these conversations, really embedding the equity framework into our conversations and considerations, and starting at this place of context and wanting to hear from different interests. So what I'll ask is just invite folks in. You don't have to go in order of any of these questions. Just want to hear what's coming up for you and really to help contextualize, learn from each other. So as I said earlier, we're not doing kind of a round robin to hear from every single person, although that would be glorious and wonderful. What I would want to make sure is that if you don't hear a perspective that you represent, I'm going to really encourage you to step into the space to make sure that your colleagues around this table are kind of hearing that perspective, hearing what you're struggling with or what you see in your interest-based day-to-day reality. So with that, I'm going to shut up and just invite folks, start us off wherever feels like the right place for you. Yeah, Mary Kyle, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And maybe I should know the answer to this question, but it would help me if to have clarification over exactly what is siting and design that falls into our scope. Those are, anyway, so, and what falls into building codes, what falls into somebody else's scope, what is being addressed in the model, in the building structure itself that we can't touch. So for example, there are many aspects of housing that have discriminated against or not been built with the consideration for people with disabilities in terms of accessibility of the housing. Is that within our, that's a design, to me, that's a design feature, but I don't know if that's within our scope. That's just one example. It's not the only example. So, so anyway, siding design, is it interior? Is it exterior? Is it how it sits on the lot? Is it, just, anyway, can you fill us in?
Yeah, so maybe Ethan, really quickly, what I'll say is at a high level, I don't know that this contextual conversation matters around what's in scope or out of scope.
Okay.
Right? It's really around just trying to ground ourselves in what's the reality that we're operating in, and it's going to impact multiple different places. Now, to the extent, and Ethan, maybe you'll completely go in a different direction. To the extent that we're having this conversation specific to kind of the rules that we're looking at, I think that's part of our next discussion. That's like, how do we look at the large landscape, and then how do we start drawing down into kind of what is the scope and what can we solve for around this RAC? But Ethan, correct me if that's...
The first bullet is about siting and design, and one of the examples is people with disabilities. So I'm using probably very layperson's approach to what a siting and design is. And anyway, however you want to answer it, but that would be useful to me.
Yeah, jump in.
All right, so the scope of DLCD's rulemaking under this program is related to, really, if we want to look at the exact language in 2258, it's section 2 sub 5 of the bill. That is approval standards. It does include some approval processes, sorry. Some design things, but really about the not interior to the structure, exterior to the structure. Like use of materiality is kind of described there, but how the building shows up on the lot, so to speak. And then when we talk about siting standards, it gets specific. It talks about setbacks, parking requirements, floor area ratios, minimum dwelling units per acre. And then there are some other pieces that I would lump into that siting standards, although they are a little bit more discrete, which are tree removal standards, and then variances and adjustments. So that's when we talk about the scope of like, what is DLCD's rulemaking, it is those things in particular.
Yeah, Mary Carol, I appreciate the question, right? And again, I think as we thought about kind of starting with a larger context, is really just understanding that what we're trying to solve for is, of course, bigger than DLCD, right? As a singular agency, right? In terms of the crisis. I forgot Vice Chair's words earlier, right? Consider what's created the crisis, I think he said, right? So I think there's just a broader conversation around just grounding ourselves in what are some of the barriers and impacts that have occurred, and then helping us narrow that into the scope of the conversation. So you started us exactly where I kind of hoped we would go. But this is kind of helping us start big and then get into the policy conversation instead of just diving right into very narrow kind of policy discussions. If that's fair. Did you want to add? Yeah.
Raise some other questions, but I'm going to think about that. I mean, I'm not sure how much, the extent to which we can address some of these. It also raises some other impacted communities issues, but others have their hands up. So
yeah, please. So let's find my order of operations here. So let's go Brock, then Karen, then Diego, Fred, Morgan.
Thank you. I think one of the ways, particularly that setting and design standards have impacted communities, is delays and abandonment of projects. If something's not clear and objective enough, right? If something is going through an extreme delay because of appeals for land use decisions or quasi-judicial land use decisions, it's going to lead to lower inventory and higher cost, which is exactly what we've been seeing over the last few decades, over and over and over. So I think, and one other piece around that too is where homes can be built. Right? Are they able to be built on areas where you're able to capitalize on economies of scale? Right? Bring in a larger portion of land, build a bunch of housing on it versus doing spot filling. All of those have significant impacts on inventory and on price, which affects everybody, but particularly lower income communities.
Right. Thank you, Brock. Karen.
Yeah, thanks. So I would say a couple things from our perspective as an affordable homeownership developer that works across multiple counties and includes multiple jurisdictions. So typically we try to build as efficiently as possible and as cost effectively as possible. So that means usually utilizing the same like 3 to 4 models of homes over and over again. With adjustments to like paint and other finishes to make them unique. Saves on costs, saves on building materials, all that kind of stuff. We oftentimes don't see that translated into when we're working with jurisdictions for approval and permitting. So for instance, if we're using 10 of the same 3-bedroom plans across a 30-unit subdivision, we have to submit that exact same home for approval and permits 10 times. It also means paying for plan review 10 times, paying for permit fees 10 times, and responding to questions 10 times on the same set of plans. It becomes more challenging if we have to go to 2 different reviewers at the same jurisdiction. It's not uncommon that we get different questions from each, even though the plan design is exactly the same. This also then is very different across jurisdictions. So sometimes we'll get 2 or 3 questions from a city or a jurisdiction that it seems motivated to move housing forward. Other times it might be upwards of 11 pages of questions back that we get, which does feel like a delay. And it has a real impact on our ability to create affordable homes for ownership. I would also say that, and then if we turn around and do the exact same project in another jurisdiction 6 months later, we go through the entire process again. And so I think what we see again is that this is creating barriers for us utilizing public funds, getting affordable home ownership opportunities on the ground, particularly when we are trying to build for low and moderate income first-time home buyers.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Dio.
Yeah, just going back to Mary Kyle's comment on accessibility, I feel like that when you had mentioned that the structure is a little bit outside the scope, I feel like because HB 2258 is for structures under 12 units, the Fair Housing Act requires units or structures with 4 units and above the ground floor units must comply with type B accessibility requirements. So I feel like a bit of that's baked in, regardless of what this committee finds. And so that was just something I wanted to throw out there as a baseline. Like there is kind of a standard established.
Yeah, thank you, Diego. Fred.
Perfect. Hi there, everybody. So for the city of Independence, one thing that I would love to just sort of throw out there is we have a certain amount of design standards that we consider as important for like providing things like eyes on the street. One thing that we don't allow is a garage in front of the front facade of a house. And that is for a public safety, eyes on the street sort of approach. We also have a certain window requirement. I would say those things fundamentally benefit communities because they promote neighborliness, they promote public safety. And I would argue that those sort of standards are appropriate and they're not overly burdensome, especially if we're targeting the front facade of a house. So
Awesome. Thank you, Fred. Morgan?
Great. So I kind of want to go back and revisit the context question around impacted communities and communities of color, especially I think in terms of the lower income households and housing affordability. And I think we're seeing at least an awakening in recognition of things like zoning, encouraging large lot sizes to sort of discriminate against certain communities. And we've made moves to address those issues, but I want to consider as we're drafting rules or requirements for this new housing that we're not resulting in rules that encourage large size homes, which has a negative impact on those same communities. So we're basically replacing discrimination at an institutional level with economic discrimination. So we just need to be cognizant of that and consider those things. Second point on Mary Kyle's concern around accessibility. So just piling on that a little bit. There is an intersection here with middle housing and bonuses for accessibility. So again, when we're considering rules for what we allow, we can think about how to structure those to leverage those bonuses and make them continue to be valuable bonuses and not just sort of override them with basic entitlement. And then one last consideration in terms of price and availability of land, we also need to be factoring in the cost for infrastructure to serve those areas. So infill may have an immediate sort of upfront cost in terms of higher priced land availability, but the cost to jurisdictions and the communities and taxpayers large in terms of extending infrastructure to areas has a consequence also. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Shane?
Thank you. This is a really huge and far-reaching question for me, so I'll just try to be as efficient as possible. My three main concerns, the first I need to elevate is as someone who is part of the transgender community, as well as someone who is HIV positive, I must really impress upon everyone that when it comes to the entire country, anti-trans sentiment and transphobic laws have reached a fever pitch in which it's been almost a hyperbolic growth in that. In proportion, on average, the safest zip codes for trans people to live in America also happen to be the zip codes that are the most expensive, not only to rent and to own, but also to develop. The reason I'm elevating this is not just because I live my life in my body, but because I know for a fact that countless transgender people, as well as their families and lovers, are moving to Oregon and Washington State because of our disproportionate protection of my community, even while Washington State does have a law consideration of banning trans girls from sports. And in Oregon, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that it is within adoptive parents' rights to literally have a freedom of speech argument if they decide not to affirm their adoptive child's gay sexuality or their gender identity, which varies from a cisgender and cis heteronormative context. On top of this, trans people experience poverty at a higher rate than the average population. So what does this mean in the context of class widening, as well as new housing feels almost like a punishment to the poor? I really am trying to put all of this together in terms of what would I try to achieve in this reality? For me, I know that queer people, when we have a chance to live communally with some form of privacy and some form of like space, we can literally make mountains move. If you give us cardboard, we make magical performances that change people's trajectories. So I'm just advocating perhaps a real elevation in terms of unit diversity, perhaps really exploring, say, if you have a fourplex, is it possible that there's ownership models where it can be a co-op or a private owner who owns the fourplex? But there's ways to design it. So one of the 2-bedroom fourplexes still have a porch, still have access to a garden, but perhaps that unit is smaller. Maybe there's a way that that may not perhaps reach all people who are moving to a region who are destitute economically. But what I have found, there's some quality about the Northwest, and I don't know if it's the water, I don't know if it's the rich earth, but when I have met people who have class inequality and they are in a class above me, they're so willing to live communally and share resources. I have had to really challenge my perspective in housing advocacy that people who have more wealth or power are not my enemy, but I really feel left behind. And my concern is, am I advocating for housing that will be created that for decades I will not be able to access? I am genuinely fearful of that, but I move through that fear and still am present here because I believe in this context. And I believe that if we don't have these conversations, we will not steward a future that is as equitable as possible. So I really appreciate the time you listening to me, and I apologize for speaking so long.
I don't apologize, Shane. You're always invited in. Thank you for sharing. Jill?
Yeah, I found that a lot of neighborhoods that may have the most affordable land is also where there maybe aren't sidewalks. And then because there's no sidewalks, there's not a lot of, there's usually aren't street trees. And then, so sometimes the problem is you're not allowed to develop, say, cottage clusters where there isn't an improved street. And that's one of the like for single family lots, that's where you can get the most density usually is from a cottage cluster. Yeah, so then they're maybe not allowed, but then even if you are allowed to build the kind of middle housing you want, there may be sidewalk infrastructure requirements, like for the street or the sidewalk, which then makes the projects prohibitive. And so then what you can only you often are only allowed to just do a single family home or maybe a duplex. So that I think is one of the biggest things that I encounter for inequity.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Maddie?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Jill? Is that the jurisdictions you're speaking to have requirements that are exempt for certain types of development, but are required for others? So in other words, if you were to build a single family home in that setting, the jurisdiction exempts or allows a construction deferral agreement for those improvements?
I think it's not so much that it's an exemption, but if there's already a house there, but maybe it's a house that is very small or it's falling apart. And so if you just replace it with place it with the same number of units, then you don't have to make any improvements. Also, I believe 80, if you do an ADU, usually you don't have to improve the road. Does that answer your question?
It does, Jill. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Jonathan?
So I know one of the barriers that we've actually heard a lot and experience every once in a while, especially with the advent of middle housing, is actually from the utility side of the world, the power grid. That's been a really ongoing problem. We actually had probably 40 unit townhouse style, but not DLCD townhouse, a non-property line separated townhouse development that literally I think sat for almost a year waiting for the power company to upgrade the power services to be able to get C of Os for that project. We've had other subdivisions that were designed around single families. And then when they came in with multifamily or middle housing, all of a sudden it was, we don't have the infrastructure to do that. And the power companies obviously needed to do some upsizing or provide limitations on what they could do. So I know that that ends up being a huge problem because even our main utility for power is recommending that they reach out even before they do pre-apps at this point in life just to see if they have enough capacity.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Jerica?
Hi. Yeah. So, although I'm here as an individual, in my professional life, I work up in Northeast, particularly working with Latino families. And one of the biggest things I hear from them is, although they're open to middle housing and all those things, the biggest thing is still cost. And so I just want to put an emphasis of like, of course, we're trying to do multiple things of where in my head, right? The goal is to create these permits that are to be easy. So that way builders and developers can quickly, get that permitting and essentially lower the cost of the process so they can start building more later. But I also just want to keep in mind of our own safety around also more than potentially 2 bedrooms would be something I'd be interested in, particularly because the families I work with, they tend to have more than just your nuclear family of 4. Particularly right now, housing continues to be really expensive, and you're seeing a lot more individuals also living and going back in with parents, or parents are moving in with families, and so are with their children. And so I would just really consider thinking about that outside of just starter homes, but actually longevity homes where parents can actually stay in place. And that children can stay and live. I also just want to second Jill's comment about sidewalk use. I live in South Burlingame, myself with my wife, and that is the biggest issue that we've actually seen around our own neighborhood, which if you were to look at the zip code that we live in, it is much more of a higher income space. We are getting some middle housing and cottage cluster kind of types over in our area, which is really awesome. And those are the only spaces literally in front. I mean, maybe I'm talking wrong to what these exact bills are, but they're the only ones that have a sidewalk. And then you literally it's creating, I will say, is a lot larger of an issue where you're still having to go in the road because although in front of the unit itself is a sidewalk, which obviously we can't solve for other single homes that are already on the lot, but just keeping that in mind is, I have just noticed that in our own neighborhood around unimproved roads as well. And so there's that. So that's how I
Thank
feel.
you, Jerica. John?
Yeah, living here on the Central Coast, our biggest dilemma is infrastructure within our communities here. Our cities can only expand so far, and mostly it's on going towards the east, which going that way, we're into state forestry, some federal forestry areas. And here in Lincoln County, there's a lot of floodplain areas that aren't buildable, but yet are still zoned for an R. So we're running, and then cost of housing is expensive here because it's coming out. A lot of the people buying the properties are from out of state and using them as rentals. So I think if the state works on, there's got to be a way of, I know we need the revenue coming in, but there's also, we have fishermen that can't afford to live here, or workers that can't afford to live in this area because they have to move to different counties and drive over an hour away. So there's more than just the low income housing or no housing. There's got to be a wider aspect to this, to look at this. And looking at these 2 bills, it doesn't really help to talk about those situations that aren't being talked about, you know, and so until we do a complete overall look at Oregon's housing, which includes infrastructure and also, you know, maybe taxation of out-of-state property owners. I don't know. I mean, it's hard. But, you know, because here, living here in the Oregon coast, you know, we can't expand west. So, I mean, so it's hard. And there are situations here that need to be addressed. And it sounds like it's not being addressed through legislation. Maybe it needs to be.
Yeah, thank you, John. So Lee, I'm gonna invite you in, and then this was really helpful for just as a grounding context conversation. And then we're gonna kind of apply these same type of questions into a more specific example that I'll ask Ethan to reflect back on this conversation and lead us into. But Lee, jump in.
Yeah, I manage construction projects for Habitat, and we are based in Portland, although we build in a lot of jurisdictions around the metro area. But primarily, we build in Portland, and there's a lot of great things about building in Portland. Financially, it's extremely supportive. There are certain departments within the city who are, very helpful about facilitating the mission. But one of the biggest obstacles we run into are the excessive design standards and design overlays and internally contradictory codes and aesthetic requirements. And it's not that they are impossible to get around, because you can get around them if you are willing to sink tens of thousands of dollars into a land use process that is not clear and objective and not doesn't have a predictable outcome. What I would really like to see coming out of, if not these sessions, then something similar, is an effort to sweep away all these standards that actively discourage our ability to build, for example, accessible housing, because those standards haven't been updated since the late 90s.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So, Ethan, I wonder if I can bring you in, and maybe just do a little bit of reflecting back and then help lead us into like, how do we translate this now into kind of a more substantive conversation about kind of our purview and scope here.
Yeah. Really good discussion so far. Thank you. And, I think it's been important to spend this time, the last 2 hours with you all talking a little bit about like rulemaking, like spending rulemaking time to talk about rulemaking and like what the scope is and how we all work together. So I appreciate, folks' patience having that conversation and diving in, asking those questions. And then also this like context setting as we're coming into having to answer some of these big questions that you all have raised in this the last 30 minutes or so of like, how is this going to work? Like, how do we think about accessible design standards in the context of design overlays in local governments? Like, how do we consider middle housing bonuses and in these processes, and how do all these pieces fit together? So thank you for that. I'm going to pull up a couple slides here and run through just to kind of couch this conversation in a little bit of like what I would describe as the beginning, the kind of first question that came to our minds and trying to think through what the rulemaking process for Oregon homes was going to entail. And that is like how you structure the rules. And we've talked a little bit about this. Jill, you've asked a couple good questions, and others too, about like what's the scope here? How are these conversations going to unfold? And I think there's a couple different ways that conversation can move through between now and August. And so this will be the first kind of diving into the details and diving into the specifics of the Oregon Homes process here. So I wanted to cue that up a little bit and jump into this set of slides. I know that we promised no presentation, but then suddenly here's a presentation. These are really just visual aids. So, feel free to kind of riff off of these. If you have questions, stop me. We can go back, all of that kind of stuff. But I think one of the questions here is, how do you set up a structure of siting and design standards that are going to work for individual local governments, for the individual housing types, and for property owners? Like, how do you square all three of those things together in a consistent framework? So, one of the, obviously we're talking about these pre-approved homes, and I would love to hear from the builder types in the room about like some of the advantages of having a known quantity of, I know that my building is already approved, and like how that just changes the dynamic that you come to a conversation with the local government in a building permit application process. Like, I would love to hear some of that once I'm through these slides from the builder folks. But fundamental concept, right? You have the Oregon home type pre-approved, you're ready to go. Now you're in search of either a lot, or you're, kind of deciding which Oregon home you are proposing to build or would like to build on a lot that you maybe already have possession over. And so we're kind of looking at this concept of, what does that building footprint look like? What's the impact of that pre-approved Oregon home? Then we're kind of looking at those eligible lots. And what we know from statute is the eligibility of lots is already defined. Like, we know the size, we know the total square footage, we know like where it generally is within an urban growth boundary. It's zoned residential. Like, those parameters are established in statute, but those can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And the work of this program is to kind of identify how those standards, those siting and design standards, actually come together with those pre-approved building plans. So there's kind of two ways that I think we, or at least maybe not the only two ways, but there are at least two ways that you could potentially think about this. And the first one is to kind of think about those siting and design standards as they run with the Oregon home type. So as they run with the particular pre-approved plan. And what I mean by that is, when you look at these Oregon home types and you're thinking about the siting and design standards that a local government might be able to apply to the development of those Oregon homes, do those kind of like grow outside of the building footprint? Like, if we're talking about setbacks, do you kind of take your footprint and add, the setback? Do you take those floor area ratios and you kind of like transpose that upon the building footprint? Things like adjustments and tree removal standards. Do those standards run with the housing type? I think is like the biggest question under this potential option, which then creates this situation where you're kind of searching for lots that are going to be suitable for your proposed Oregon home type. And that might require you to think a little bit differently about how that's oriented on the site and which Oregon home type you're actually able to build. And maybe it's as simple as you just flip it around and it's not oriented to the street, as an example, as you're kind of searching for, like which Oregon home type would be able to be built on any given lot that you're kind of considering. That's the first kind of framework. Do those standards run with the actual housing type itself? And I think there's a different approach, which is where you could think about these standards running with the lot itself, and considering you kind of are whittling away the periphery of a lot, or you're kind of you're transposing those sites or those standards on the lot itself, kind of regardless of the housing type that you're seeking to build. And so under this one, obviously we've got these different shapes and sizes, and those lots come in all sorts of different configurations. And you're kind of reducing down, you're applying those setbacks, you're considering parking requirements, and you're kind of shading out those areas where you wouldn't be able to kind of cite the footprint of an Oregon home. And so that kind of creates the structure where you have an eligible lot and you kind of know where you can't build. And then it's just a matter of finding the Oregon home type that fits within that available space left over. So in this example, this single room occupancy building wouldn't fit. So then you'd be kind of looking at a different Oregon home type that you'd be eligible for construction on that particular lot. So I just wanted to use that as kind of a framing or one of the major questions that this rulemaking advisory committee, I would love to hear thoughts on. Do these different, are there advantages to one of these approaches? Does it not matter in the grand scheme of things? Do we not need to care about this in this way? I'd love to hear all of those thoughts from folks. And I'll go back to my original question when I started this, which is from like a builder's perspective. When you're considering, okay, under the Oregon Homes Program, I have my pre-approved building plan. And like now I'm showing up at the counter of the city to get approval. Like, what does it mean for you to have all that pre-approved plan already in the bag? Does that change the way, like in which specific ways does that change your development process or the conversations you're having with local governments and the things you're considering? So that's my quick overview to cue up discussion and get the gears turning a little bit. But yeah, happy to have some discussion around any and all of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ethan. So maybe just any questions for clarity? And if not, maybe to Ethan's ask, if we could start with builders, developers in the room, what would we need to understand? What would you lean towards? What would be the challenges, advantages, disadvantages? And of course, kind of weaving in our previous conversation to this extent. Destin, let's start with you.
Yeah, so definitely one of the big frustrations of being a builder developer, right, is that you could build a 3,500 square foot house or a 1,200 square foot house on the same lot, but you couldn't have several 1,200 square foot houses on the same lot. So, but there is this interesting rub that we're dealing with here where we're very limited on a particular, site design aspect. And a lot of this is impacted by, fire access and protecting individual households' livelihoods, right? So if you have a single room occupancy development on a single lot, you're protecting, 8, 10, 20 households from fire code issues rather than just one family that might have, multiple ways out. So there's a weird utility conflict associated with that. And certainly in Portland, we've been really excited to see a lot of these infill lots, especially out in Southeast, where you can get multiple houses onto a deep lot and really, compete with that square footage density. But there becomes these issues of parking and trash that obviously make things fairly impactful to the households around them. So there's a weird balancing act there that's kind of tough to say whether your first scheme or your second scheme is preferable on it. I mean, certainly in the vacuum, the second would be the preferable, that you just have a set of rules and anything can plug into that. I think I lost my second piece of thought on it, so I'll just pass.
We can come back to you if you would like to add back, Lee.
I actually did have a couple clarifying questions.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, jump in.
The first one is the concept behind this pre-approved plan that the set of plans that are pre-approved can't be modified in any way?
There are abilities within the framework, the bill framework, to structure some like variations and adjustments that might be afforded to the builder. I think there's a question though about, and I guess Andy, I'm kind of looking at you in terms of what that might mean from a building codes perspective to, I don't know, shift some element of the building to a different site or reorient those things, what that would mean from the pre-approval of the actual structure itself.
Well, I wonder, just Andy, before you jump in, like Lee, did you have a specific example that would be?
I actually have a second question, which is what's the source for these pre-approved plans in this scheme? Like, does Habitat get to submit its plans to be added to the pre-approved library? And if we do that, does that mean that they're pre-approved for us, or does that mean they're pre-approved for everyone who wants to build attached townhomes in the state of Oregon?
Yeah, Andy, you got those?
Yeah, so on the permit ready on the building side, the permit ready plans, there's really two categories here. There's permit ready plans, which are sort of either drafted or like gone where we go out to someone and have someone create the plan for building codes, and then they become plans become the property of building codes that are sort of promulgated for everybody to use if they want them. And then there's the master plans program, which is a developer comes in and gets something pre-approved by the division, and that plan stays the property of that developer. And it's been approved in the same way that priority plans have, and will still need to go to locals for like local site conditions approval. But sort of those are the two tracks that it could go. And so if a plan is approved with the master plan program, it does not get published to the website. It does not get available for anybody to use. It's still the property of that developer.
Okay.
In terms of modifications, availability and modifications on the building code side are pretty limited. Generally, it's thought that it's going to be just this plan is the plan, and if you're going to use it, you're going to use it as is. On the permit ready side, like you could, in theory, take that plan and use it as the starting point for your own plan, but then it's no longer a permit ready plan. It still has to go through the whole plan review process.
Okay.
You good, Joe? All right, Lee, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, so I'm an architect, but I work with several developers on a pretty regular basis. And I would say that, at least for my clients, I think they're willing to accept a certain amount of requirements. But it's helpful if it's consistent. Like they just want to know what to expect. Even if it's a list of 20 things, if it's always the same 20 things, that's a huge relief. And honestly, as an architect, most of my work goes into the site plan design. The unit plan is sort of the easy part a lot of the times, and it's plugging the units in to make it work for each particular lot and zone and jurisdiction. So there's that piece. So specifically about setbacks, I think that it's almost like it could be a combination of the type and the lot. So for example, like I don't know if the type really matters. People think they don't want 12 units in a lot behind their house, but I think they find that it's not that much different than if it was 2 units. I know there's people will disagree with me about parking, but I guess in terms of just the livability, I don't know if the number of units is as much of an impact as like the height of the building. So I guess I would say for setbacks, if you like, I'm working on a project that's a 1-story unit, we have to have a 20-foot rear setback. And I can't understand why a 1-story building would really be that imposing. Whereas I could see if it was a 3-story building, you would maybe want a bigger setback. So I guess I'm thinking like if maybe instead of type, it would be like mass. So maybe it's a combination of FAR and height or stories that would impact I mean, what kind of a setback you'd want for the, specifically, I think for the rear and the side setbacks. But then also I think it really depends on where those lots are located, because I work primarily in urban areas and we're used to these 5-foot rear and side setbacks. But, you know, a more rural community, even though it's maybe within the urban growth boundary, like I'm thinking about, like Newport, Oregon, that has an urban growth boundary, is my understanding. But people have a different expectation about how much space they have between their neighbors. So that's a long way of saying, I think that it is where it's located and also how tall and massive the building ends up being.
Ethan,
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah, I want to be certain to point out that I'm not trying to like set up this false dichotomy of like it has to be one of these two things, and there's shades of there's spectrum there. And I think you're raising a really good point, Jill, which is should the rules be structured to apply different standards to different housing types, or maybe different scales of development? So like if you have a pre-approved single-story cottage cluster, for example, is that the same because it's a cottage cluster? Should the same standards be applied to a more compact two-story or attached cottage cluster? Like that's a question that we need to wrestle with as an advisory committee of like, how many different tiers or levels do we entertain in terms of how that regulatory structure is going to be framed? And this kind of dichotomy that I've set up is one way to think about that. Like, do we want to focus on citing standards that run with the housing type, or should we just focus on standards that run with a lot, and then whatever the housing type ends up being or whatever fits within what's the space that's left over, we structure rules that way.
Yeah, I don't know if folks can speak to like the advantages and disadvantages more. I think Destin, you started going down that path of, well, it kind of depends, and there's some advantages in this one or disadvantages in that, and maybe hearing a bit more around that piece. Jonathan, jump in.
Well, I think some of the advantages and disadvantages end up being where I was going to go with it. The lot specific is, a nice clean way to do it in a lot of cases, but it is unit specific in certain aspects because depending on what you're doing in middle housing, or since we are looking at multifamily, multi-dwelling now, also, the differences from that fire protection perspective is significantly different between the two building codes. So that needs to be somehow captured in there. The joy of the building code is we don't say you can't do something. You can pretty much put a house right on a property line as far as we care. It's just what you're going to be doing to that. So the design may not work at that point. And the last thing we want to do is encourage people to think they have a permit ready plan and then get into a jurisdiction and it's like, oh, that doesn't work. So I think it does end up being a happy balance to show where they can potentially put it on if it's this style of house. And it may be some reference to the specific specialty codes instead of just, as and meeting the requirements of the building code type concept.
Awesome. Thank you. Brock?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful to view it too through the frame of, is it in a form of attached housing or detached housing, right? Because if you're building, let's say a plex, right, you could build 6 units there and they could all be attached, and that has very different siding standards than if you're building a 6-unit cottage cluster development, for example, right? So I think maybe in addition to, but I think focusing in on kind of like how does it fit on the lot, whether the lot has to be subdivided, right? If it's going to be a townhome, and whether that's attached or detached. So there's some nuance there as well.
Thanks. Alexandra?
I'll add kind of an additional layer to this, which I think it does have to be kind of a happy medium. We do have a growing kind of number of jurisdictions who are wanting to look at middle housing less from a like these types of housing can go on this lot way, and more towards this number of units can go on this lot way, because once you add like attached, detached, cottage cluster, duplex, at some point it all kind of ceases. Like you have fire code differences, you have those like building code differences, but like the actual on the ground like planning differences are not that different. So you have to, I would love to see a balance, just because like more flexibility for jurisdictions at the end of the day also can mean more flexibility for developers. So the balance there would be incredibly helpful.
Thanks, Alexandra. Shane?
Thank you. I apologize if I didn't realize if someone else had been making this point, but something I just have a lot of deep ignorance on is the intersection between all the permitting bureaucracy that definitely adds cost, as people are describing in beautiful detail, but also like the litigious nature of how we segment like condos versus like, let me just give it a lived example. In a different reality, many, many years ago, when I was a different person before my transition, I qualified for a mortgage. And I was so excited. I'm like, oh, look at me. I'm a little baby professional. I have no children. I just take care of plants. What's appropriate for me? Because I don't want to own a 4 or 5 bedroom craftsman. I mean, if you gave it to me fee simple, I would do great things with it, but that's not appropriate for me, right? So I end up looking at condo prices in frickin' Sellwood, and like a 1 bedroom condo is 650,000. This was like 5 years ago, right? Why on earth is a 1 bedroom condo $650,000 when someone else can get a 3 bedroom, 2 bath in outer Foster Powell and start gentrifying that place? So when this comes up to widening wealth inequity, and especially, I'm just going to state it, algorithmic price fixing schemes have been found to violate antitrust law, right? That is occurring where people have algorithmic structures, like little digital fingers going all over America looking for just that price point of, is it walkable? What's the infrastructure? Can we bear this cost of holding this property for 10, 20, 30 years? Because people on that, as my mom said, the rich are different. There's a certain level of rich people, they don't care about dignity. They only care about efficiency for the bottom line. And I'm just really scared because I'm like, there's a lot of stuff I could genuinely criticize on a systemic anti-market level, but let me put my leftists aside and try to be a little more neutral. Why on earth is a 1 bedroom condo the same as a 3 bedroom, 2 bath house when the law isn't the same? And from what I heard years ago, there's just a different layer of like legal requirements and like why on earth should be the developer be tied? Like, I just don't understand it. It makes me upset. I need answers.
That's definitely something we should touch on our next conversation, Shane. But I think one of the points that maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but maybe one of the points that you're raising is that it should matter less about the development proposal. And it's more along the lines of like maybe it's kind of just whatever fits within that box that's left over, and it's more like a lot specific kind of approach. And we should just kind of like get out of the way a little bit to let development happen in that.
And I was all over the place. I guess the fine point I really want to articulate is like, could the actual legal requirements and the possibility for litigation literally be such an existential barrier that the fear of that occurring adds so much more invisible cost to what is already a really difficult landscape, especially when I know the vast majority of my friends under 40, gosh, if I could own a 1 unit in a 6-plex and just have a housing co-op, I'd be good for the next 20 or 30 years. And it just seems so impossible to build these cooperative ownership models that do require on a condoization more model rather than things that we've done in the past. Am I articulating that okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it might be, yeah, so perhaps a follow-up conversation. And then Shane, I don't know if it's getting to, some of what we've heard from others just around the kind of process of appeal. I think Lee, you talked about just kind of some of if you have the resources to kind of go through all the bureaucratic, you can get around certain things, which just then has a different scale of cost that's absorbed into a particular type of project for a particular type of owner versus
And sorry, just one other thing, and I will boop. It's just also articulating the invisible emotional realities that are not only entangled within these processes, but also like I have witnessed how frustration and feeling like you're not heard over and over, and also that the process is truly restrictive. It's like trying to throw a clematis, a vining flower at the ground and asking it to make its own trellis. And so when it comes to developers, renters, people who are homeless, I'm just trying to figure out how can we craft this invisible framework that is a true trellis for supporting all different kinds of ecology when it comes to the renter, the ownership, and the developer framework. Because at the end of the day, I think that's the most difficult part of not knowing what we know and then articulating that and just stating, hey, how can we cut through the quick and just be more efficient about this and just reduce the barriers, reduce the bureaucracy? Because how much of that time and process alone would then create a market of like, oh, Why would we even develop in Oregon or Portland where there's this huge housing need? And this will grow over the next 50 years because of our natural resources, where we're placed in terms of the climate crisis. We will have growth. I'm just really concerned of if we don't state our invisible barriers, then we don't even know how to articulate a kind of language and rhetoric that could be codified in code, which respects everyone and cuts through that quick.
Thank you, Shane. Let's Fred and then Eric.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, so a couple of things. For one, I think use is allowed use. Unfortunately, is something that we're going to need to consider when we're talking about lot specific too. Just because smaller communities like the City of Independence, we're not required to allow middle, like plexes under our code. So based on that, really trying to get to the allowed use is something I think if we're talking about lots, we have to consider as well. The second thing I'll just add is I do think the conversation about parking is an interesting conversation to have. I would be welcome to hear what everybody's thinking about parking as related to these things.
Do you want to offer your own thoughts, Fred, or is that just an invite for others?
I will offer my own thoughts. So like in the City of Independence, for instance, we only allow a 24-foot curb cut at the front of a lot. That's essentially 2 spaces across the front of a lot. And so thinking about how that would work for something like a Plex, for instance, that would turn into either something that you're taking to the back of the lot or something that you're extending across the front of the lot. I think generally from what I've heard from our residents is they don't want a whole bunch they're fine with allowing the additional housing intensity on a lot. They're not fine with taking the fronts of lots and making them into parking lots, especially in existing residential neighborhoods. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for just illustrating, right, that some of these potential kind of tension points between kind of local desire and things that are built into design and siting with some other conflicts that can come up. Eric, jump in.
Thanks. I just want to second Jill's comment generally about unit type not mattering quite as much as mass and form. And, I think to that end, lot size probably, and starting with lot size probably gets there a little bit better than the unit type, just because that's kind of what is already in the neighborhood, in the community. The standard, if I'm reading the legislation correctly, this applies to, maximum lot sizes up to 20,000 square feet. And so these are usually going to be infill type lots. If a, neighbor community knows the lot size next door, they might have a pretty good expectation about, what could be coming. On the same note, the developer can look at that lot size and know what they can actually put down. I think there could be a benefit to both, but I think starting with lot size might get to the context that home is being placed in a little bit better and more consistently. And then I just go back to the building code, and I'm probably getting way ahead here in this process, but I just want to get it out early. I just think about the ready home plans and, for example, that ready home plan, and even if we determine setbacks with that ready home plan, we're not necessarily going to know what's next door. And, for example, if there's a historic building or a commercial building at a 0 lot line, that's going to change the requirement for that building next door, because that building is going in next, and then the fire code is going to apply to that new wall. And so, I don't want to create false expectations for a builder. I guess they would have to go in and look at what's next door, and then understand that, hey, that now ready home plan, because that ready home plan did not account for a firewall. Even though it fits on the lot, technically, because there's a building at a 0 lot line instead of a building 5 feet away from the lot line on the adjacent property, that ready home plan then no longer works because of that adjacent lot and just the simple location of that building on the adjacent lot. So I think it's going to be an imperfect system, which is okay. I don't think we're going to drill down into perfection here and clear, you know, 100% certainty in every single situation. But I think we just need to be realistic that there's going to be existing conditions and existing buildings out there. And even if we have ready home lots, it could still be difficult to put a home on that lot given the circumstances.
Yeah, Maddie, maybe you're gonna to help clarify, because that is part of the conversation we need to have, right? Is around if we do go to think about lots that would be kind of pre-qualified, I don't know if that's the right word, the criteria and considerations that would have to be attached to it. But Maddie, jump in.
Yeah, Eric, I appreciate your raising that topic again. I know it came up in terms of, like, we've talked a little bit about the type of housing, the lots themselves, and perhaps the lots themselves are impacted by where those lots sit, the context in which they exist. So what you just described about having a building with zero lot line adjacent to an existing lot might make that lot set more significant. Similarly, if the lot has elevation change, there might be a different level of setback required on an existing lot. So in a lot of ways, you're reinforcing this consideration of how might the lots be tailored to accommodate certain housing types or a certain assumption around eligibility. And I also similarly appreciate the where are we citing certain elements or certain additional lots. For example, the idea of putting units behind other units and accessibility, access for fire, not accessibility for folks with ability challenges, but more like how do services access those new housing units. Someone brought up parking and trash, I think and fire access most certainly is a very serious consideration that often is a decision-making point for eligibility of certain housing types. So I'm really appreciative that you've raised those things, and I think we might consider them to kind of fit into this lot setback model in a way. And what's important to think about, Eric, is that each of those lots are specific cases. So a consideration of when one is exploring the opportunity of what lots might be eligible for the housing type that I typically build, or a particular housing type that a community identifies as needed based on housing capacity analyses, among other, or contextualized housing need in the case of an ONA community. These are all considerations that might filter through what are the eligible lots available in the community for which of the types. And each of those lots might have some tailoring that needs to be considered based on their context. So those types of considerations are the things that we really want to focus on in our conversations both today and into the future. So as you begin thinking through this, as this starts filtering through your brain as you're working through your days, bringing those up to us is critically important. And thanks for sharing those.
I think it's raised a couple questions in my mind, which is, are there instances where a pre-approved Oregon home plan simply does not fit or is not eligible for construction on an Oregon home eligible lot, like where only a duplex could really fit under this framework that we're crafting, and a quadplex just isn't going to be able to be constructed due to all of the building code and land use frameworks around that we are establishing here. Like, is that an acceptable outcome of this work? Or should we start from the premise of we have to structure these standards such that all of these Oregon homes should fit or should be able to be constructed on these eligible lots? And I think that's just a question that folks probably have immediate gut reactions to, but something worth us discussing in this throughout this process. And then second is there a role for I don't even know what the right word is, but I'll use the word override in the example that Eric, you're talking about of, the situation where building codes or you have this pre-approved plan, but because of its relationship to everything around it, it requires a fire rated wall that wouldn't exist in some situation. And because of that building code interaction, the eligibility or the use of that pre-approved plan is kind of overridden. That's another question that I think is an important one for us to consider. So hopefully that generated some thoughts. I saw some hands, but
Generated well, Alexander, we'll go to you. Morgan, I thought I saw your hand up. Does it go back down? All right, Alexander, jump in.
I'll go ahead and pop in here. I think it would be helpful to have some kind of a conversation about what an override or a like exception process looks like for local jurisdictions, because what we don't want to end up with, and I don't think the builders want to end up with either, is it like going through the beginning of the process and saying like, okay, you're all pre-approved, and then getting to the inspection stage and the inspector coming in and saying, no, actually, this doesn't work. You need to do X, Y, Z, or like go back to the drawing board entirely, because that's not actually going to get us more housing. And this process cannot account for all of the different variety of things that we could see on the ground next door, or like weird outside things, 241 communities in Oregon, 250 different circumstances. Like, you're talking about so much variety that we do have to talk about, like, we don't want to end up like, I'll give the example of, communities east of the Cascades. They have snow. And so in the winter, you have to account for an extra, so many feet because you have snow on the roads. And so your fire trucks and things like that aren't going to be able to get through as easily. Like, all of those things are going to impact this in a way that we just can't simply fully control for.
Well, thanks, Alexandra. So let's go Morgan, Karen, Jonathan, Brock.
I got a few things, but I'll try to be quick. Back to the first question around whether we should focus on lot standards or housing type standards, and kind of echoing what Alexandra was bringing up earlier. I just did a quick calculation for the numbers of variations of cottage cluster configurations we could do. 16 units in 1 to 4 unit buildings, 64 varieties of that. And then we add on other things. I'm also, as a long range planner, I'm thinking about the future and what happens to these housing types as they convert and adapt over time. So if we shift from one housing type to a different kind of housing type because we've added a unit, does that upset that regulatory balance? Are we going to look at, legislative fixes to address that concern? So just thinking sort of long term on that question, I kind of pull back to the lot orientation, but happy to hear other ideas on that. I love that someone brought up trash. I think that's a sort of important thing that we need to think about. It's something that we missed in the residential infill project, and I think builders are starting to see, we're getting complaints from some of their clients about issues that are coming out of that. And so we're trying to catch up to that problem, but if we can address it up front, that'd be great. Parking, obviously a good one, challenging. So a lot of conversation probably about that. I'm also happy to hear that Andy is listening in. I have long been a fan of this notion of, and I know it's outside of our scope, but it just putting a plug in here. We have a zoning code that speaks to 1 to 4 or 6 units. We need a building code that has expanded to capture middle housing. And that's missing. And we're starting to see rubs because of that. So I know we're not going to fix that problem here, but because I have your ears, I wanted to put that plug in. Thanks.
Thanks, Morgan. Karen.
Thanks. I guess, Ethan, to your first question that you just posed, I would just reiterate, like, we're in a housing crisis. We need a lot of units on the ground really quickly. So the more that we are focused on increasing unit production across the state, the better. And I would also echo, I think, what Jill said earlier around predictability, right? We need, as a builder, when we go and walk up to a counter with a plan, like, we need to know exactly if it's 20 things, what are the 20 things that we need to deal with? And so to the conversation around things that can override our ready plans, I would just caution us not to have death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? We're all going to be able to find the things that are different in this community versus this community versus this community. And that is where projects stall. There are, I think, some common things that we can identify, but as much as we can daylight those now, it's going to actually allow us to utilize this process and actually implement it, and not just have a well-intentioned process that is another thing that we can't actually use to speed up development.
Just Karen, really quickly, so is there, out of the approaches that Ethan laid out, does one or the other lend itself more to kind of that building more with more predictability?
I mean, I think my answer, that's probably not the one you're looking for, is probably a mix of both.
Well, I think that's what we're hearing from folks,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to hear
Yeah.
some clarity.
Thanks.
It's not what I want to hear. DLCD's looking for the clear, unequivocal, everybody agrees on the same direction, which maybe is not what's happening. Jonathan, then Brock.
So a couple clarifications and then something. So just for the aspect of the fire separation, I know it was brought up to adjacent buildings. So we don't look at the adjacent building. Our authority stops at that property line. So you can have another building that's at a 0 lot line and it doesn't impact the design of the new building. The new building goes to that property line and that's where it would stop. So that generally doesn't offer a challenge. The part you would have to watch for is if there was, say, an easement for a no build easement or something like that on the neighboring property, which it has been a regular occurrence. And I know BCD even just put out an interpretation, I think a year ago, that technically still allowed under the building code. So, that's one element you'd have to look at, but it wouldn't prevent another building to even go 0 lot line right to that other wall without impacting that. The state codes are very adamant that what was built legally before the implementation of our current codes are allowed to exist. So there's that aspect. And then one of the things that, from a jurisdiction that does have a master plan program and we readily use it, it is nice to have that more, you can't make alterations to the plans within that master program because then they know exactly what's there. It does streamline the review process because then they are literally looking at, does it fit on the site? From our public works perspective, what's the impervious services so they can meet our MS4 requirements and we can get the permit out the door because the plan's already there. And literally for how our process works, we hold the plans. The applicant just tells us which model number they're doing. We bring it over digitally and send it out the door. They just have to give us a new site plan. So implementation is awesome in how you actually do it. So, but less changes is better, obviously, because then it muddies up that system. And I think that's where like Karen and them are emphasizing the problem is the muddying of water after you go there.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Eric?
Thanks. And I just wanted to clarify in response to Jonathan, I think, and please do weigh in. What I was thinking was if there's another a building there, it would affect maybe the new building that gets in and no, okay. So yeah, no, great. That's good. And I just maybe really big picture then wanted to weigh in on land use versus building code. I think if I'm understanding the legislation correctly, it says basically, it doesn't really matter what the local jurisdiction's comprehensive plan says or what the land use regulations say. And so we're looking at, orientation, design, things like that. I think from my perspective anyway, from Sherwood, it's pretty clear, that all of those things cannot be considered. And so that's why I'm fairly focused on, what is going to hold us up in terms of actually implementing this. And to me, it's actually building code. I mean, sure, we'll weigh in on what we think correct, setbacks are and things like that for a community, for a certain unit type. But I think we fully understand it doesn't matter what our code says right now. So that's why I'm focused on code and making sure that as we put it down, it can actually be put down as expected by the builder who is sponsoring that plan or wanting to actually put it on a specific one. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Jonathan?
I just wanted to circle back since we were talking about Andy and their team. They actually have done an amazing job of circling it back and making middle housing into the residential code. As we talked about earlier, those stacked duplex options in a townhouse type format. So you have the ability within the residential code right now to build 3plexes and 4plexes straight out of the residential code without having to do any fire sprinklers or anything that would have been required out of the commercial code. So they are doing an amazing job of making sure that they have a true low-rise code to address this.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jill?
So my clients, they're mostly doing infill lots. And so my understanding for a commercial developer is it's not so much that they're thinking, I want to put a duplex somewhere. It's more like, because they're looking at the lot that they found, because the lot is the hard part. Maybe I've said that before, but that's the hard part, is finding a lot that is buildable, as they say. And so then it's usually a matter of what is the building type or the housing type that I can pick that will get me the most units that are around the square footage that I know sells or knows gets me a certain amount of money. And so they're coming at it that way. And so I just bring that up because I'm seeing a challenge of how usable will these pre-approved plans be if it's I don't know, like if you're trying to get the most lots, and sometimes say if it's a cottage cluster, you maybe have multiple unit designs in order to make it work. And so I don't know how, I guess I'm doing a little bit of thinking out loud, if you can tell. I'm not sure how that would work with a cottage cluster. If, like, is it gonna have to be one unit type in order for it to be pre-approved? That's just something that's on my mind. And also I'm thinking about this issue with trash. We do have a little bit of a disconnect with kind of what the building code allows for trash. Just as you're trying to max out a site, sometimes it would be nice, like, I don't know, say you had a 4-unit, you had a quadplex, to be able to attach that trash to the building. Sometimes there isn't room to have it be a detached unit or detached, like an accessory structure, and all of the requirements that go along with that. But then you're not really, there's rules about, I'm maybe getting into the weeds, but I guess a commercial project, you would just be able to put a 1-hour wall with no openings between the units and the trash, and then you could have it. But it's not that straightforward for when you start to get multiple units that are attached. Anyway, we can put a pin in that for later, but just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think you touched on one of the questions that I probably did not a great job of asking, but the point you made at the beginning about builders aren't like, okay, I've got a duplex, like, let me go find where I can build a duplex. And you know, I think Oregon Home presents an opportunity to have your own like library of buildings that are ready to go. And then it's just a matter of finding a lot that's going to accommodate. And I think from like this kind of where to land on whether citing standards should run with the type or the lot, I think you know, just knowing that the development process is such that knowing what that envelope is and knowing how those standards apply to each individual lot makes a lot of sense to kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm showing my cards a little bit, but I think it makes sense to go towards that kind of lot specific approach, because it doesn't really matter at that point, like what pre-approved plan, it's just a matter of which one. And, you know, I think that that provides that ultimate, a little bit more flexibility, or at least I'm seeing that as a pro to that approach.
Well, certainly saw some heads nodding, and Jill, I think the way you articulated kind of the lot is the hard part, right? I think resonated with at least some of the body language seeing around. Brock, your hand was up.
Oh, yeah, I was just bouncing off what Ethan said. The way he started was, I have all these plans, and where can I fit it? And then, but you finished it with the way that I think you meant it the first time, which is, I have this lot, what can I fit there?
Okay, thank you. Fred?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could do essentially both. You could take a set of plans and you could say this could fit on X size lot. And I guess when we're talking about the type, I don't think that we're talking about the footprint for a type per se, but like perhaps a model itself, or a Oregon home plan, a set of plans itself that could fit on a certain lot area. Because then, if that makes sense, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, Maddie?
Can I just clarify that, Fred? So, and maybe for others too, is that, so the building codes division, Andy, and your team, you're looking at pre-approved building plans, and you're looking specifically at the building envelope, the wall to wall. And what you're maybe not looking at is anything in addition to the building envelope that might be a consideration of citing it.
Correct.
And what we are tasked with in this conversation that we'll have over the next several months is there an additional amount of citing criteria that's required for each type? And it sounds like the answer to that might be yes, to some extent, but maybe with like a limited number of them and a level of predictability to them. And then there's really the, like Jill, we'll keep coming back to you because you said a very simple and brilliant thing, which is the lot is the hard part. Every community, every lot is different. And the criteria and considerations typically impact that envelope plus about a project. And that's what makes these projects each their own special, unique project rather than a replicable form. And so maybe there are some really specific things that lot can and cannot be in order to fit these two pieces together. And I'm just restating what I'm hearing, but if that resonates with you all, please show some acknowledgement of that. But if it doesn't, please raise your hand and say, this doesn't make any sense, or what particular things are we missing?
Some general resonation. Maybe this goes back, Lee, to some of your comments and questions earlier around the combination of kind of building codes, creating its own kind of library, and this flexibility for kind of master plans that you could shop, right? The type of design that you've had pre-approved with the lots that are available. And so maybe we're solving for some of that. Eric, you have your hand up, and then Brock, jump in.
Yeah, maybe just a clarification for Andy and Matt. Maddie, you mentioned wall to wall. I guess, Andy, are you guys looking at, so you're not looking at where it's at on the lot. But my understanding is, depending on where it's at on the lot would dictate what that wall would need to be built to. So I guess if we're coming up with the pre-approved plans first, then it is going to matter where it goes on that lot. So for example, if that pre-approved plan was not meant to be a zero lot line, it then could not be placed at the lot line. It would need to be placed at a certain setback to work based on the building code.
To the extent that like where on the lot and the site conditions impact the application of the building code, those are things that would be taken into account. But to the extent that they don't, it wouldn't. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an important part of this group is taking those pre-approved plans and the building code, assumptions that went into them, and then landing them, correctly on these lots. And I think that's what gets to the override. And as a local jurisdiction, I'm not interested in overrides just for overrides. For me, overrides would be simply based on safety and building code. And if the pre-approved plan, as you try and place it on that lot, then doesn't meet fire code, something else, then that potentially would be the override. So thanks.
Thanks, Brock. So you'll probably be the last comment probably for today, unless there's somebody with a burning comment. But Brock, jump in.
Sounds good. A little unrelated, and I probably should have brought it up earlier. When I'm looking at 4B in section 2 of 2258, it talks about buildable area, and then has a couple square feet references for different types. The way that I'm reading this is that looking at buildable area, it's talking about footprint. And so when we're talking about per unit size, that only actually applies to the cottage clusters and multi-unit dwelling. The way that I read this statute, as long as the footprint is under 2,200 square feet, it doesn't matter how many square feet of internal livable area you have. It's a strange way to write it. I wish I had caught it when the bill was still being worked, but because but types with a buildable area, not a livable area. So it would be footprint, not square feet for that B sub A. Sub B big A.
Ethan?
I'm just making a note of that to check.
Good. Brock will always keep those
4B.
the legislation. Yeah.
4BA, Brock.
Yeah.
And is that a point of clarity, Brock? Like like a legislative interpretation of what it's saying and just getting clarity for as a baseline, or is there a deeper comment on?
More for clarity, just because I noticed in the presentation, or the couple of slides that were up earlier, it was like, oh, you can put in a single family home or a plex of up to 2,200 square feet.
Yep.
Bill, by saying buildable area instead of livable area, makes it clear that that's footprint, and then the per unit size kicks in with that B sub big B for cottage clusters and multi-unit dwellings.
Perfect. Okay. Well, let's move to closing. Really appreciate this conversation. I think at some point we've heard from virtually everyone today, which I love, and obviously folks came prepared to have the discussion. So did want to talk just a little bit about do we actually have a next steps? Yeah, well, I guess it's closing and next steps. So maybe before, just reminding folks, our next meeting will be March 11th from 9 to 12. Please feel free to reach out to either our team at Kearns and West or the DLCD team if there's things that we can do to improve this process. Heard some things in terms of, Shane, you're asked to help really structure, like really preview the questions. Ethan, I think you acknowledged, right? We had some slides that kind of presentation that was shared today that wasn't shared before the meeting. So things like that we can work to reconcile. But if there's other things that will help you all feel like you can give us some initial feedback, because this was we tried some new things. Felt like a robust conversation, but just making sure that you all feel like you can come in every meeting and really contribute to your fullest potential. So Ethan, if you want to offer some reflections or any kind of final thoughts, or Brock, do you have a question, comment?
I was just going to say, for communicating with the department, is the housing.dlcd still the right one? Okay, got it. Just want to make sure.
Right one.
Yeah, can we can somebody put it in the chat and let's say it out loud?
Yeah, happy to.
Okay.
All right, so Maddie's got the schedule up on the screen. Thank you for that. Just to kind of preview where we are heading next and how we're going to be cycling through. I don't know, has anybody ever played Sims, or like maybe even like Roller Coaster Tycoon or something like that, where you're trying to place these things and it's red and you can't place it, you can't click the button, it won't let you build it until it turns green. And I think that's like what we're looking to do here, and that like imagery kept popping into my head throughout this conversation of like, what are the conditions under which those Oregon homes turn green and you can actually click and build it and it can come to fruition. So very helpful conversation, and so thank you for that. In terms of the ways in which to communicate with the department, well, actually, let me start first. I think touching on Ben's point there right at the end, which is, if you've been part of a rulemaking process at DLCD before, you'll notice that this is going to be pretty different in just in terms of the way that we structure the presentations and how we provide material. So please, please, please don't feel shy about letting us know how that's working, or if it's not working. Please let us know, because this is new. Like I mentioned, we've already learned several lessons in just the week that we've tried it. So continue to send that feedback back to the department. And the way that you can do that is you can send us an email. We have a housing division kind of group email that we all get notified when we get emails into that inbox, so it does not go into one person's email inbox and get lost. So feel free to use this email address to send any comments related to rulemaking. That is housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. Apologies for all the dots and the things in there, but so it goes. One of the things that would be really, really helpful in any communications that you send to the department around this rulemaking, sending it to that email address, would be to include whether or not it's just a clarifying question for staff, like, hey, when's the next meeting? Or if you would like it to be kind of provided as public comment, like I have something to say on this piece of this work, and I would like this included in the rulemaking record, like, please address my concerns. That would be really helpful for you to do that in the subject line of those emails that you send over for staff or as public comment. That'd be very helpful. What else? What else do we have? What am I missing, Ben?
I don't think so, other than I had to Google roller coaster tycoon to know what the
Oh,
heck
come
that was. So
on.
maybe I missed that. I was a little aged out of Atari video games maybe by
Yeah.
that
We're all
time.
the 90s kids. Yeah, exactly.
So dating myself perhaps. Yeah, no, I think that's probably it. So yeah, just a lot of appreciation for how folks showed up, and we'll continue to work to improve the process, but hopefully you got a feel for type of community, type of discussions that we're hoping to have in this space as part of this rulemaking. And so it's 11:58. We'll give you 2 minutes back. Much love and appreciation for y'all. We'll see you next time. Don't hesitate to reach out. Take care.